call to the Indian Point Decommissioning Oversight Board meeting of May 19, 2022. We have a rather packed agenda, and it's 3 hours long. Thank you, Tom. So we're going to try to keep very much to schedule, so I'm immediately going to turn it over to Mr. Tom Gognan, our chairperson.
Thank you, Supervisor Becker, and thank you all for being here tonight. Nice to be in person. Unfortunately, there still is a high COVID caseload, so we do recommend masking for those of you who choose to. And we've also attempted to do virtual hybrid tonight, and we apologize for the technical difficulties with that. It worked when we tested it, but you know, we'll keep working it through. I'm going to try to make up some time since we're 15 minutes late, and I'm going to jump straight into the roll call. And in that, I can see many individuals here. I'm just going to highlight who is here, and then I'm not sure we're going to be able to ask the virtual attendees for their attendance at this time. But with us today, we have Assemblywoman Sandy Galiff, School Superintendent Joe Hochreiter, Supervisor Richard Becker, Mayor Teresa Knickerbocker, Susan Spear, the Assistant Director of Operations for the County of Westchester, Richard Webster from Riverkeeper, Jennifer Waka from the Office of Emergency Management, Jeff Goinup from Department of Labor, Elise Peterson from NYSERDA. Lou Picani is not here, but we are joined by Bill Smith and Tom Carey, our labor reps. Rich Baroni is here from Holtec. He will be presenting later on this evening. For those in person, looks like I caught everyone. John Sipos, our counsel. I'm Tom Congdon, the chair. Sorry, I see Dana Levenberg from Town of Ossining is a guest as well. Nice to have you. So next slide, please. Is anyone working the slides? Okay, no one's working the slides at the moment, so we're going to just go over the agenda. Thank you. As Supervisor Becker said, we do have a packed agenda. Tonight, in addition to hearing updates from Holtec and agency staff, we're going to have presentations from Jennifer Waka, from Office of Emergency Management on emergency preparedness plans, from Columbia University representatives on their project to review options for environmental monitoring at the BV Elementary School. We're also pleased to have our first community guest speaker with us today, Courtney Williams. And due to popular demand, we've changed up the order of our agenda so that we're going to have the public statement portion of the meeting earlier on in the agenda. Next slide, please. I want to just take a moment to recognize the staff of the agencies, both at the state level and at the local level, for all their incredible work in preparing for tonight's meeting and for their day-to-day work in helping to ensure a smooth transition for the host communities, as well as ensuring a safe decommissioning of the plant. They are on hand to answer each and every question we take in from members of the community. And they are on hand to essentially work with us through new issues as they develop. Also want to thank our volunteer independent board members, Richard Webster from Riverkeeper and Dave Lockbaum, our nuclear expert, for countless hours that they are spending on DOB activities. Most especially, I want to recognize and give thanks to the workers who are performing the enormously consequential task of decommissioning Indian Point. You all are making the site safer every single day, and we depend on your professionalism, your integrity, and we're grateful for your commitment to safety. If you ever feel that you are being asked to do something that put workers or the public at risk, we encourage you to call us on our whistleblower hotline, which is displayed on the screen, and we will have your back. Next slide, please. Next slide. I want to give just a few updates on some activities of the DOB staff in between meetings. We highlighted some work that we were doing based on the presentation we received from Rick Kuprowitz regarding pipeline safety. We executed, or I should say, Holtec and Enbridge executed a memorandum of understanding that formalizes the protocols we discussed at the last meeting pertaining to heavy load crossings and notifications that are required under the joint proposal that approved the sale to Holtec. We heard from the community a request that we post our Q&A earlier so the community has time to process a lot of dense information before subsequent meetings. We were able to get that Q&A posted a few weeks ago, and we'll continue to endeavor to be timely with that. We have made a lot of progress in hiring a resident inspector at the DPS. There was a pretty robust response to our job opportunity notice, and we're expecting to have someone on board well before the next meeting in July. We had some correspondence exchanged with Holtec. Some of you, I'm sure, read news about some of the NRC violation citations that Holtec has been the subject of over the past several years, actually, at several plants, not Indian Point. But we look at that as a team at DPS, and we share with our technical experts, Mr. Lochbaum and Mr. Webster, and talk through whether there's anything actionable for our agencies and our oversight role. And really what we noticed in some of the citations, that there were some trends of some changes made outside of NRC approvals that Holtec had done at other sites. And that was of concern because it appeared that there was some trends that seemed that they weren't taking corrective actions in a manner that prevented the similar kinds of citations from recurring. So we flagged for them a number of violations that seemed to be on a trend line over the last several years, and Holtec did respond to that. They acknowledged the citations. They acknowledged that there were trends and highlighted that they have taken a number of corrective actions meant to ensure that those similar kinds of violations didn't occur in the future or at Indian Point. I think this will be a topic for further discussion among our agencies and with Holtec, but we appreciate their responsiveness to the letter. The next quick update, public engagement. There's been a very active community here for a long time, dealing with issues pertaining to Indian Point even before there was a closure. We have tremendous respect for the members of the community who have taken a lot of time of their own to really learn a lot about the issues. They have a lot to offer. We want to hear from them. But that being said, the members of the community have written to us letters, and they've highlighted a number of areas where they think that the DOB meetings themselves can be improved to improve public engagement. And so we've done a number of things already in response to those requests. There's requests for more frequent meetings. We've done that. We've set the dates ahead of time so people can plan. We've heard the desire to have more back and forth, so we've addressed that through adding a slot on our agendas going forward for community guest speakers, and we're happy to have a community guest speaker tonight. We have heard that folks don't want to wait until the end of our very long, detailed meetings late into the night to have the public statement portion of the meeting. We're going to bump that up this time. And we're continuing to look for ways to, next slide please, to further our public engagement opportunities. So what we're proposing is a meeting in July that will be dedicated primarily to be a public forum. We're proposing that we provide as much advance notice of the public forum as possible to solicit questions from the community that we can take and share with the relevant experts in agencies and maybe at the company. There will be potentially questions, for Enbridge, and we will invite them for the pipeline issues. And then we would organize those questions by topic area, and we would call the individuals up to ask their questions, and then have the relevant expert or relevant individual respond. We'll try to leave time for some back and forth, follow-up questions from DOB members or from the individual posing the question. And I've shared this idea just this week with the DOB members. Got a little bit of feedback via email. I appreciate that, but just wanted to open it up quickly to see if there are any other recommendations for how to proceed with a public forum style meeting next time.
I think it's a great idea, Tom, and it's just a way for anyone in the community, because there are so many groups and organizations that have been involved in all these issues, and it's a way for them to all come forward. And so what you're going to do is try to get information as to what the questions are, just to be sure that you know them, and then get the experts. I assume we'll do a hybrid, because the experts may be somewhere else, as opposed to here?
Well, I think that'll be determined. I think our experience tonight is a teachable moment. This hybrid is not going well, obviously. And so long as, we're not seeing, an explosion of COVID cases, I think that we may want to go entirely in person next time.
Okay.
So with that, I've made up 5 minutes. I'll ask John Sipos to try to make up as much as that. I'm going to turn it over to John to provide a quick overview of some agency updates. John?
Thanks, Tom. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'd also like to just acknowledge Manager Green is here from Clearwater. Good to see you in person. And so the first slide we have here is on the monitoring.
Next slide, please.
Is the ongoing monitoring that occurs at Indian Point. And I'll just go through this fairly quickly. Indian Point is one of a very few number of plants in the country that has this continuous radiation monitoring capability. That capability has been maintained following the closure of the Unit 3 reactor. It is ongoing. Holtec, I'd like to acknowledge, is maintaining that. That was part of the agreement we reached last year. And the information from that system goes to various state agencies, including the Department of Public Service. And our staff, our expert staff, Bridget Freimeyer, is monitoring that. And to date, there have been there have been no abnormal readings. So if we could just go to the next slide, please.
And while we're waiting for the next slide, I've got a ping to the speakers when you're at the table to just introduce yourself by name so that folks on the line know who's speaking. This is John Sipos.
Thank you. And in fact, this is an example that Bridget was able to receive this morning. This is this morning's data result from the monitoring. Excuse me, it's yesterday's. And there are a variety of monitors in a rough circle around the site, 2 of which are near the elementary school. And, again, Indian Point, a unique site that has this capability. It's being maintained in the short term. We think that's a positive step and promotes the public interest. I'm going to just go to the next slide. In terms of our oversight activity, DPS staff continues to visit the site and maintain contact with Holtec representatives, interact with them on various issues. As Tom mentioned, the state inspector position is expected to be finalized in the near future. And we have been also receiving daily weather reports and other pertinent data readouts every day as required, as Holtec agreed. And to date, there have been no safety concerns reported.
Next slide.
One of the issues that I'm sure all folks remember from the proceedings over the last several years is financial viability, financial reporting. There have been monthly meetings since Holtec closed on the deal with Entergy, and DPS staff and staff from other expert state agencies have attended these meetings. They occur every month. And it is an opportunity for state regulatory officials to interact with Holtec and vice versa. Holtec reports that the decommissioning project as a whole is ahead of schedule and is under budget. Also, we have received the annual financial reports that are required under both the federal regulations and the joint proposal. We are reviewing that, and we anticipate having a meeting with senior Holtec staff to review and go over that in the coming months. At this point, Holtec has been, in compliance with the trust fund obligations. Going to go to the next slide. There are a number of issues going on at the federal government level. There has been a long-running rulemaking at the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission on decommissioning. The comments were supposed to be due I think this week, and that was recently extended until the end of August. That comment deadline, I know a number of folks in the room, a number of folks watching are keenly interested in that. And I think that has just hit the Federal Register. Also, in the beginning of May, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff issued a letter on the review of the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, or PSDAR. We like to have our acronyms. And that May 5 letter, which we have the citation here for on the Adams document platform, contains NRC's staff's observation that the PSDAR that Holtec submitted in December of 2019 contained the expected and anticipated information that the NRC staff would be looking for, and that letter also contains a brief summary of some public comments. And again, this is in the way the NRC goes about doing things. This is they have received the letter, they have received the PSDAR, they have acknowledged it, and they've said it contains the information that they would expect. It is not a discretionary approval of a certain pathway. That is not what the NRC does at this stage. There are also a couple of exemption requests that are working their way through the federal system. One is concerning relaxation of federal regulations for emergency planning, and I think that that may be discussed later today. There's also an exemption request regarding the contents of the cask, and there's another exemption request that is pending that's not on this slide. It is a request to relax federal regulations concerning insurance coverage for the, I'd say, the interim or the short-term period. That is also being reviewed. NRC is deciding whether to relax the insurance coverage regulations. I think that concludes the DPS aspect of the interactions with Holtec and the site and the federal agencies, and I think we can now pick it up with DEC.
Thanks, John. It looks like Richard may have a question.
Yeah, it's Richard here. I just wanted to have a comment, actually, which is John's been very diplomatic here. I think what we see and what we saw in the article about Holtec is the NRC is not doing a very good job regulating nuclear plants. We all know that. Happily, through our New York State Assembly member and Senate member, Sandy Galeff and Peter Harkin, we were able to get jurisdiction over the transaction through DPS and then have the joint proposal. And I think what we're seeing here is the results of that jurisdiction. So we have a much better supervision approach because we have New York State supervising as well as the NRC. Whereas for those people who know me, I actually do live in New Jersey. For those poor folks at Oyster Creek, all they have is the NRC. And I think we see a big difference.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sorry, another question?
Just a quick
Yep.
question, Sandy Gale. So with these exemptions that they're asking for from the NRC, do we have a statement in opposition to them or support of them or anything?
So the exemption requests are docketed with the NRC. They are served, they are given to the state agencies. I don't want to necessarily get out in front of what the state agencies may or may not be doing, but the state agencies, including NYSERDA and Elise Peterson is here tonight, receives, catches, and then distributes those exemption requests, in a prompt manner out to state agencies, and they are being looked at. I mean, if I could give an example of just about the crane, and Elise could probably, write a chapter in a book about the amount of work by state officials to ensure that the crane application, the amendment of the operating license, that was done in a thorough way. And that crane is important to facilitate the decommissioning process. So yes, I mean, so in answer to your question, the state is involved. The state is aware of these exemptions, and there have been a number of occasions in the past where the state has weighed in at the NRC and has opposed certain exemptions, such as in the fire safety realm over the last decade. So the state is aware, and I think maybe I'll leave it at that. I don't know if that's sufficient right now.
Okay, well, maybe at the next meeting, well, you could report if the state has done anything on those three categories.
Yes.
Just, thank you.
So I'm not sure we're going to be able to turn it over to presenters who are attending virtually. There are a number of our DOB members attending virtually, including Senator Harcum, David Lockbaum, Kelly Turturro, Tom Scaglione, among others. But we're going to give it an attempt because Kelly Turturro has a few slides pertaining to some DEC updates. If it doesn't work right away, I'm going to suggest we skip those slides. All of the slides will be available on our website immediately following the meeting, and we'll call Rich Baroni up from Holtec. So I'm going to give it a try. Kelly, can you hear us, and can you try speaking?
I can hear you, Tom. Can you hear me?
We can. That's terrific. If we can just go to the next slide for Kelly, please.
Good evening. I'm Kelly Turturro. I am the Regional Director for DEC's Hudson Valley Office, the Department of Environmental Conservation. And I just have two quick updates on work that DEC is doing. First, on our administrative consent order, we continue to work to finalize both the citizen participation plan as well as the scoping work plan, and hope to have those documents finalized shortly. And next slide, please. We are also working on the state Speedies permit, which governs discharges from the facility. That application is before DEC, and we continue to review that application to determine if a modification to the permit is necessary. And that's all for my updates this evening, Tom.
You can't hear her back there? Okay. Yeah. Why don't we ask John Sipos to present the next couple slides on behalf of DEC? You guys can hear us in person, right? Courtney? Okay. Yeah. So John, go ahead. Kelly, we're just having a difficult time hearing you, so we're going to just ask John to finish your slides.
And just to review the last two in a sentence or two, DEC staff is actively engaged in the citizen participation plan. This is part of the agreement that was arrived at last year and working out the scope of work with Holtec. So, DEC remedial staff is working on that diligently, and on the SPEEDs, or State Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, DEC is also reviewing Holtec's application for that. There have been, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is entitled Dust Mitigation. This is an issue that we have heard from the community on. We have listened to those concerns, and the DOB and the state agencies are working on that. There are DEC standards and guidance that we have here, that were cited here, and as well the Village of Buchanan and the County of Westchester also have a role to play in this area. And we are working, the state is working with the village, the county, and also with DEC subject matter experts to work on examining this issue in a comprehensive way, and to look at incorporating standards into a demolition permit. And there is a fair bit of time before this will be necessary, and we are confident that there is the opportunity for there to be collaboration amongst the various governmental agencies there. And I think that is the last slide on DEC's aspect. And Tom, I don't know if we're ready to call Holtec.
Yep, I'd like to keep things moving along, especially with the in-person presenters. So Rich, why don't you join us at the table for an update from Holtec?
Tom, a quickie.
Yeah.
Public comment on those permits?
Okay, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Public comment will presumably be available on those permits.
On the
draft.
demolition permits?
On the speedies.
On the
draft,
speedies.
and then maybe the demo.
On the citizen participation plan for the decommissioning, and I believe also the speedies aspect, there will be, there's always a opportunity for public comment, and I believe that DEC, again, I should be careful as a DPS attorney speaking for DEC. I'm sure Jared Schneider will be upset with me, but I imagine that DEC would be, would take public comment into account in its decision-making process.
That's correct, John.
Oh, excellent. I'm so glad you can back me up. And tell Jared I was doing the right thing.
Now you can bill him for your time.
Thank you very much. Rich, thanks for joining us. I'm going to just turn it
No, my
over to you. Sorry?
My pleasure.
Yes. And so hopefully the slides will keep up with your remarks. Just try to shout out for a slide advance when you're ready. Go ahead.
Hey, so thanks, Tom, for inviting me to the meeting. I'm Rich Baroni. I am the Site Vice President here at Indian Point. Next slide. Next one. Next slide. Anyway, this is the agenda I put together. It's basically what we've accomplished since the last meeting that we had on March 17th, and where we project we will be by the time the next meeting rolls around on July 27th. Right, so I'll present the following, really the status of our dry fuel project. That within that project there are three broad areas. We'll talk about the asphyxie pad. We'll talk about the spent fuel pool, the building and the activities around those buildings, and we'll talk about the high lift crane. And then we'll talk about vessel segmentation, both for Unit 2 and Unit 3. I'll talk to building demolition. I'll talk further about the NRC inspections and activities we have, and within that grouping I did talk about some of the exemption requests. And then some of the state correspondence and commitments we've made since the last meeting. Next slide. Hey, so the dry fuel project really consists of three broad areas: the asphyxie pad construction, SFSI is the independent spent fuel storage installation. The other major areas are spent fuel pool building, the modifications we're making, and the activities surrounding the building, and then the installation of the high lift crane specific to Unit 3. With that said, and I'll recap, the dry fuel project really concludes with all fuel from both spent fuel pools on the independent spent fuel pool storage installation pads. So we're calling that fuel on pad protected. So you'll see that acronym, right? And we project will be done fuel on pad protected in October of 2023. And then to accomplish that, we need to construct an additional SFSI pad, and that's going to house. The numbers get a little confusing. With the additional SFSI pad will actually house 52 casks. The existing pad will house 75. So those are the two big numbers. Then the overall big number, the overall cask account will be 127 casks. So those are really the three numbers: 127, 75 on the existing pad, and 52 on the pad expansion. So since the last Oversight Board meeting, we had to install a retaining wall on the north end of the pad. That's been constructed, and we have backfilled that. We've started the installation of conduits to support monitoring equipment. That's in progress. We did some grading around both pads to facilitate transport of the vehicle cast transporter that I'll get into later. And then we started the installation of rebar and expansion joints, and that's in progress. Prior to the next meeting, we will start the final pour of the new pad on June 14th. We'll continue with grading around the existing and the new pad, and we'll continue with preparations to support monitoring equipment. Next slide. This shows the construction of the north wall. I'd like to recognize Giordano Builders. They're doing a great job on the wall and on the pad itself. So the north wall is complete, and the top picture just shows some of the framing and work that I had to do to construct the wall. Next page. Next slide. Really, this next slide, the intent here was just to show, no, you went too far. Back one. Back now. Well, anyway. One more back. All right, we're struggling here. Okay, right there. So that shows the rebar that we've installed. That's okay. Can we go one further? I'll just go. So we've installed rebar. We continue to install rebar on, that's called the mud mat. That's the subsurface of the SFSI pad. There'll be another 3 feet of concrete that we need to pour on top of that pad. The rebar is just about complete. Then the boxing around the pad is just about complete. So we're going pretty well with the SFSI pad. We expect we'll be done in the August time frame. We really won't need it until later on, but we'll be done in August, which is good. Next slide. That's the rebar slide. Next slide. And so then we're doing some contouring and leveling of the areas outside the existing pad and the new pad, and how we transition from one pad to the next. So we're putting a lot of, it's called item 4, and you can see the workers grading everything out and leveling it. So I'm pretty pleased with the SFSI pad construction to date. Next slide. So the second area that we're focusing on is the spent fuel pool buildings themselves. Just to recap, there'll be 896 fuel assemblies need to be cast at Unit 2. That's going to require 28 casks. And then there'll be 1,280 assemblies that need to be cast at Unit 3. That's going to require 41 casks. So the Unit 2 spent fuel pool offload campaign is scheduled to start in August of this year. And then we'll start the Unit 3 offload campaign in February of '23. At the present time, we are on schedule with these start dates. So I've had to split the slides into two groupings, one for Unit 2 and one for Unit 3. So we'll start with Unit 2. And then since the last Oversight Board meeting, all fuel assembly inspections were completed satisfactory. That's a requirement prior to loading any of the casks. The load plan per cask has been finalized, so we know exactly which fuel assemblies are going to go into each cask themselves, right? There's limitations on dose and kW. We put a new helium driver, that's being installed. That's it's going to be a more efficient dryer to dry out the casks themselves. And we started transport rail repairs outside the spent fuel pool building. And I'll show you the picture next after that. So projected activities through the end of July will complete the installation of the helium dryer. We'll complete rail repairs outside the spent fuel pool building. We'll complete PM activities on 3 major pieces of equipment: the fuel handling machine, the crane that actually moves the casks, and the VCT, the vehicle cask transporter. It's critical for us to get those PMs done so that we have as seamless a period of defueling the Unit 2 pool as possible. And then come this June, we're going to start accepting delivery of the new MPCs and the high storms. The MPCs are multiple MPC. Anyway, they're going to house the fuel, multiple purpose canister. That houses the fuel, and the MPC goes into the high storm itself. So those two devices or those two components will start being delivered in June. So if we go to the next slide, actually what we have to do is what we found in the fall when we did 4 casks. We found degradation in the grouting of that rail system. That rail system is used to transport the high storm out of the Unit 2 spent fuel pool building. So the grouting was degraded. We actually saw some of the rollers binding on it. So in order to prevent that from happening again, we are taking all the grouting out, right? We're replacing all the rails and replacing all the bolting so that we'll have a good system to transport the high storm cask out of the Unit 2 spent fuel pool. Next slide. For those of you who haven't been at the plant, that's the vehicle cask transporter. It's a big machine, all right? That actually will transport the casks from the pad to the pool. And so we're doing a full PM on that machine to make sure that its operation is flawless as we empty Unit 2's pool. The next slide. And then we're also PMing those two components. So the component in white that you see, that's our fuel handling machine. So that actually takes the fuel out of the spent fuel pool racks and installs it into the MPC, the multiple purpose canister. Then the crane that you see in yellow is manufactured by Etera, but it actually is the crane that will move the casks within the building. So we're doing an extensive PM on that also. So once these PM activities are all done, plus the rail outside, those were the major activities we found that needed to be done just following the 4 casks that we moved in the fall. So we'll be ready to go come August in Unit 2. Next slide. So those are the near-term activities in the Unit 2 pool. And then now I'll try to swing over to Unit 3. And so since the last Oversight Board meeting, again, we've done all the fuel assembly inspections, so we're complete at SAT, at the same as we did at Unit 2. We had to modify the suction piping to the spent fuel pool cooling pumps. That was completed due to an interference that we'll have with the high lift crane, so we had to move that pipe. We've commenced removal of the backup spent fuel pool cooling system again to facilitate installation of the high lift crane. We have to repair the floor. The floor, and I'll show you pictures after. The floor wasn't it wasn't bad, it wasn't in bad shape, but it housed a waste transfer system that we have since moved. That waste transfer system contained a curb. We had to remove the curb and have a flat surface in that building for the transport of the casks out of the building. Right, so we're in the midst of doing that, right? And then we, like I said, we've completed removal of the rad waste processing skid. All of the work really here is due to, except for the first bullet, is really due to the high lift installation that we need to do. And so through the end of July, we'll continue with the modifications to the building. There's some duct work that has to be relocated. The heating system within the building for worker comfort has to be repaired. There's some walkways and backup spent fuel pool cooling system. Those all have to be modified to accommodate the high lift crane installation. Next slide. So if you look at the picture on the left, that was a pretty massive scaffold that, again, Giordano Builders had to build to modify that suction line. That suction line had to be moved, I think it was 4 inches. So we had to isolate the line, put the backup spent fuel pool cooling system in service. We successfully moved the line the 4 inches, and then we put the system back in service. That was all done with no issues, no safety concerns, and well within any rad exposure limits. So that was the major pipe issue that we had to take care of. And then on the right, you could see where we're modifying the curb. That curb had a steel runner through it, so we're taking out that curb to flatten out the floor in that building.
Rich, is the work on the left side done?
Yes, that's complete. However, that's a good question. Thanks, Tom. You see the walkway on top? That walkway poses another, that's the yellow structure you see on top. That poses another interference to the high lift crane, so that'll have to be modified also, working on that. We're confident, we have no issues really with the high lift being installed to meet the February 2023 timeframe to start the offload. Next slide. So the high lift update, this is really the third area I'll discuss tonight in our plans to install the high lift in the Unit 3 spent fuel pool building. So we did submit an LAR to the NRC March 24th of 2020, requesting the installation of the high lift crane, and the NRC granted approval through a safety evaluation report dated February 25th of 2022. Since the last Oversight Board meeting, parts required for assembly have been delivered. We still need additional parts to be delivered for full assembly. Construction of the crane is started for the factory acceptance test, and that'll be done in Holtec's facility in Pittsburgh. And then the engineering change package to facilitate the installation at the site that has been started, and that'll be completed in August. And projected activities through the end of July, complete the crane fabrication by June 1st. The factory acceptance test is currently scheduled for June 10th, and then the high lift will arrive on site 7/8. I don't think we're going to meet those dates. We're having some issues with the materials being shipped from overseas, I believe, so those dates will slip, and I'll have a better idea after the July meeting when we will do those 3 activities. However, we're still confident that, again, we'll meet the February 23 date. If we turn the slide, I'm sorry, next slide. The strand jacks will be used to actually lift and lower the load. So the strand jacks are in. There's only one needed. There's 2 backups. And then the outrigger arms are used to control the crane operation. So those are all in. But there's other parts that are needed that we still have to wait on. And then to the right of the outrigger arms are the hydraulic power units that'll be used to control the outrigger arms themselves. So that's all I have for our first critical path. And that's, again, our critical path is pool to pad. October of 23 is our due date. Are there any questions on pool to pad before I go any further?
So, Rich, I'm going to read a question. There was a mention of fuel on pad protected, but Holtec did not specify what the fuel is protected from. Could you describe as it protected from?
Sure. What happens
pipeline,
there is-
rupture, fire, or anything else?
No. We have a protected area of the site. Most of the people who've been there, punched in. That protected area of the site shrinks down to basically the 2 asphyxie pads, right? And so that's what we call fuel on pad protected, where the protected area of the site is now minimized, just to protect the fuel itself. Now, by protection, we have a full-blown security system, right? Monitoring equipment, security housing facility, that all comes with that.
And that's on the northern side of the site.
Correct, it's the north side. The existing, I guess I should have shown it, I'm sorry. The new asphyxie pad expansion is right next to the existing asphyxie pad.
Sandy Galiff again. Maybe I should know this. What's the helium dryer?
That's a good
You've
question. So
installed it.
what
What
we
does
do
that
is we
do?
dry out the cask, we dry the fuel, because it goes in wet, right? Goes into the MPC wet. So we use a helium dryer, the higher helium dryer, to totally evacuate any moisture out of the cask itself. We use a helium-based system.
I have a couple of questions, Rich. Richard Webster here. First of all, you said you disabled the cooling system for a while and used the backup. Does that mean you were without a backup for a while?
The backup system was mainly used during refueling outages if we needed it, right? So right now, we don't need it. We have the normal system in place.
Right, but I heard you say when you were moving that line,
We
You
don't need it, and its components were where we're going to install the high lift crane.
right.
So we're
I heard-
removing it.
I heard when you were removing that, you had to use the backup system,
We have multiple other systems we can use for backup if we had to,
such as?
such as emergency pumps with emergency water sources we can use if we had to, and that's all driven by procedure.
Okay. Could you let me have the procedure for
Sure.
that? That'd be great. Thanks. One other thing. I have a couple other questions. So, one is, I've been out on the river, and you can clearly see the FC pad from the river. It always struck me that we'd be a lot better protected if we took away the line of sight from the river. Do you have any plans to do that?
I heard from the last meeting, we're potentially talking about a berm. I think if you look at the east side of the pad, we're pretty well below grade. You may see up to 2 feet on top of the canister when we're all said and done. The north side, we have the retaining wall, plus it's a wooded area on the north side. Then the south side is basically, I'd say it's below grade. So your concern is on the riverside.
And if you think we can't see them, I'll offer you a ride on the boat.
I can't understand you
If you
saying.
think we can't see them, I'll offer you a ride on the boat. We'll agree that we can see them, I think, when we get there.
The Riverkeeper boat.
I can't understand.
The Riverkeeper, he's offering you a ride on the Riverkeeper boat.
sure.
So you can see from
No,
the
it's
river.
okay, I'll pass. But I'll tell you that
It's a nice boat.
there's no room to put a berm there. However, and then we also have to worry about line of sight for safety, or for the security forces, for security.
Sure.
Right, so potentially, I think at Pilgrim, they're putting a line of trees there, so I'm gonna talk to them to see if potentially we could do something. But I guess I'm more worried about security and line of sight, and making sure that the guards, right, are fully capable of seeing anybody who would want to come into the area. Now, it'll be fenced off, obviously, right? But, there's still a line of sight.
I'm just saying that there's a weakness there, as far as I can see, in the security system.
The weakness for being what?
I don't want to specify directly, but it seems to me that if I was if I had malicious intent and I was on a boat, I could hit those casks
With?
with a missile.
Okay. All right, it's your opinion. I
I
understand.
mean, I don't think it's a controversial opinion. Again, if you want to come to the boat, we can look
No,
at
it's
it.
okay, I'll pass. Thank you.
Final thing, because I don't want to hog everybody's time here. You mentioned monitors being installed on the IFC pad. What monitors are those?
I'm sorry, I can't understand.
So monitors on the Azifsi pad, possibly for heat or radiation?
Right, so we'll have probably TLDs, I believe, on the fence line itself, but I can't get into the security installation that's going on right now.
They're security monitors, though, not environmental monitors.
There will be a security system within the pad itself, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on fuel? Okay, next slide. I'm sorry.
Just one quick question.
Supervisor Levenberg.
Thank you. Supervisor Levenberg, thank you. As you're pouring the pads, is there any sort of testing that goes on to make sure that that's up to standard so that they?
Yeah, the concrete's tested prior to the pour. Do a slump test, I believe is what it's called.
Okay. And then after the pour as well? I mean, is there
After the
anything
pour
to
is-
make sure that it's?
I'll have to get back to that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, with that said, the second critical path is vessel segmentation, all right? And much like the fuel to pad, we have two separate sets of work activities proceeding in each of the two containment buildings. All right, Unit 3 is the primary unit at the present time, and Unit 2 work activities will trail that by 6 to 8 months. So since the last Oversight Board meeting, at Unit 2, we're talking about Unit 2 specifically now, we removed the feed water and main steam lines from the steam generators. I'll show you a picture of that. We removed insulation from the reactor cooling system loops. We removed internal stand structures from the reactor cavity. And we completed the hatch enlargement and the roll-up door installation, much like we have at Unit 3. And then projected activities through the end of July. We should commence cutting steam domes of the 4 steam generators. I'll show you pictures of that and why we're doing it. In fact, we started 21 steam generator this week, cutting its steam dome. We'll remove additional cavity interferences. We're going to commence cutting the RCS loops, and we'll demo the old equipment hatch. Next slide. So if you go into containment, that's a typical steam generator. There's 4 per unit. The insulation is stripped. If you look at the picture on the left, I'm sorry. So the insulation is stripped. The bottom black pipe was the old feed line, and the top pipe that came off the top of the steam generator was the steam line. So we're in the process of taking all of that apart. Since we are PWR, or isolated in the steam generator, at least in the top works, all that's coming out clean, as a matter of fact, right now. Next slide. And then we've completed the enlargement of the equipment hatch at Unit 2. We used the same diamond wire cutting technique that was used at Unit 3. It's a water-cooled system that limited, or we generated absolutely no dust. And then we also kept the building at a negative pressure so that all air flow was inside the building and not out. Right, so that equipment hatch is now complete at both units. Next slide, please. So now I'll transfer over to Unit 3. Right, so all 4 steam generated domes have been cut. 3 of the 8 RCS loops have been cut and isolated from the reactor. The old equipment hatch has been disassembled and disposed of. The missile shield blocks have been removed and disposed of. So the missile shield blocks are actually a series of concrete, huge concrete blocks on top of the reactor through a support system. Those are all been removed and disposed of. The nuclear instrumentation detectors, you might have heard the term NIs. They've been removed and they're being disposed of. We've commenced installation of the transport system, and that system is going to be used to transport heavy loads out of containment. And then we've commenced training of individuals and those responsible for segmentation activities. And then the projected activities through the end of July, we'll complete the transport system and remove the steam generated domes. We'll complete the segmentation team training. We'll ship the segmentation tooling following the training to the site. We'll continue with the RCS loop cuts, and we'll prep for tooling and support structure installation in the reactor cavity. So the next set of pictures will help explain all this. Next slide. If you really focus on the middle picture first, that's the diamond wire rope that we use. It's also has the ability to cut through steel. So we not only used it to cut through the containment structure, we're also using it to cut through the steel of the steam generators, the upper halves. And then you could see the picture on the right-hand side. Within the orange paint is where we actually did the cuts. So all 4 steam generators in Unit 3 have now been cut. Next picture. Next slide, I'm sorry. So we're in the process of installing this transport system. So the top picture is a picture in plan, and the bottom picture is a picture in section. So if you look at it, right, we'll remove the top of the steam generators, put them on this rail system, and transport the top of the steam generators out of the building with what's called a gold hopper. It's a multi-wheel transporter that will bring the steam domes to what we'll call a rad pen. These coming out clean. All right, then we'll cut up the metal and dispose of the metal that way. And the reason why we're doing that, and I'll show it to you probably in July, is it'll allow us to set up working platforms within containment to do the segmentation. It's kind of hard to explain that without showing you pictures, but they're just none available right now, right? But at the end of the day, the reason why we're doing that is just to facilitate the segmentation process itself. Next slide. All right, so the slide on the left shows the gapping that we're doing. We're isolating the reactor vessel itself from the rest of the reactor coolant system. So we'll put a plug on the reactor coolant side and just a steel plate on the steam generator side. All the loops have been drained. Right, so the picture on the right is actually the plug that'll go into one of 8 legs that come out of the reactor itself. There's 4 hot legs and 4 cold legs. Right, so that'll allow us, again, isolate the reactor vessel, and then when we flood up the cavity to do the actual cutting, everything will stay intact and we won't transport any other fluids, additional fluids throughout the system. Next slide. So this is just the segmentation support structure that's being shipped to the site. It's from Canada. We've gotten most of the pieces for Unit 3 and more to follow. Next slide. So what you're seeing here is a mock-up of the reactor cavity in Canada. That's where we're doing the testing, and that's where the system is being manufactured. Right, so we'll install this system in the cavity, and that's going to facilitate cutting of the reactor vessel itself and its internals. Next slide. All right, so here's a series of pictures. Actually, if you start with the one on the left, right, it's actually a saw blade. We'll use 3 different types of saw blades, a 72-inch, 60, and a 44, I believe. Those are the 3 sizes, right? And you can see we're practicing. The wood is actually a simulation of the reactor internals. All right, so we're actually practicing first. The team that's going to actually do the segmentation itself is up there in training right now. So we'll start on wood. So we'll do horizontal cuts. And then if you look at the middle picture, it's kind of hard to see, but we'll actually do vertical cuts within the vessel itself. And so after we're done practicing on the wood frame, we'll transfer over to some metal cutting, and that's the metal piece they'll start cutting. That's the picture on the right. So training is scheduled to be completed by the end of this month. So that wraps up my discussion on vessel segmentation, pending any questions.
Tom? Yeah, Tom?
Thank you, Rich. Tom Carey.
Hey, Tom.
So just thinking about the older generators, like the ones the ones we took out of Unit 2, they're probably roughly 20 years old,
Yeah.
right? Why are those in a vault and these new ones are just going to get shipped out? They don't have to remain on site for any period of time?
Well, actually, the ones in the vault had to be replaced because of steam generator leaks we had years past, right? So that's why they're in the mausoleum, so to speak. These are being cut, again, to facilitate a platform that will need to house some of this equipment, right, for vessel segmentation, right? So we're able to cut those domes, right, and the steam side is basically clean, right? The ones in the mausoleum had tube leaks, right, that contaminated the internals of those steam generators, right? So these are clean compared to what's in the mausoleums themselves.
Okay.
Then there's a whole process we're going to go through. We're bringing in a couple different vendors as to how we can clean those steam generators in the mausoleums.
And same goes for the reactor? There's gonna be
Reactor's
no-
going to be cut up. Yeah, it's going to be cut up in there's 3 different levels of waste, which require 3 different types of canisters. So when those come in, and as we cut the vessel itself and the internals, they'll go into canisters, and those canisters will get shipped to Texas,
But
rail and road.
But they will be radioactive, right? The reactors?
Yeah, but they're in the cask. I mean, it's just like we ship radioactive waste now.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Anything else on vessel seg?
John?
And Rich, it's actually not the vessel, but it's the steam generator, and just following up on a question you had. So what about the tubes inside the existing?
That's a good question. So
Steam
we're cutting
generator.
above the tubes,
Okay,
right? And we're gonna weld a lid.
like a cap.
On top of that. And then we'll keep that side full of water for dose control also. Water's our friend, right?
Right, and then the tubes will then be treated.
Right. Eventually, we'll get down to, as we go through the decommissioning process, we'll get to those later on, right? But not initially.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Could I follow up on Sandy Gale again? So when your waste, which I guess is low-level waste, is going to Texas, is it low-level?
Yeah.
It's low-level,
Then, well, you know, there's different levels, right?
right?
There's low level, and there's alpha waste, there's Bravo Charlie waste, and then there'll be greater than Class C, right? And we'll handle all of those accordingly with the reg requirements. Alpha and Bravo Charlie can be shipped to Texas.
Okay. So it's being shipped. Is that the waste that's going to Connecticut first?
I'm sorry, can you repeat
Is
that?
it going to Connecticut first? Is it
Okay,
being
so we
shipped-
use, that's a good question. So we use Connecticut as a rail spur.
Right.
And that's where we'll transfer the load from a flatbed to a flat car, right? Yeah, so we'll use both methods, rail and road, to ship any kind of waste.
You talked about the missile shield blocks being removed and disposed of. Are there missile shield blocks that will be, I assume, that was for security for the
No.
reactor? Okay.
It's just a term we use. The missile shield blocks, there's another term we use too. When the reactor was operational, right, we had what was called a bed spring. Bed spring would come down, right, and all the connections to the control rod system, the rod position indication system, went all through this bed spring, right? And on top of that metal structure, or that metal configuration, was all I-beams and cable, we put these missile blocks, right? And that was for missile generation if you had an ejected rod accident, right? So we no longer need those missile blocks. I know it's a term that people are scratching their head, I get it, but we no longer need them.
And then I'm curious why you need to practice the cuts. Practice, yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, practice makes perfect. It's kind of the first evolution that our people are getting involved with, right? So there's a methodology on how to run this saw. You just can't plunge into the metal and expect it to work. You gotta, and it's kind of a delicate operation to begin with, right?
So there are people like who will be in somewhere
Well, there'll
see
be
them?
people
Where?
activating, operating the stores, remote stores, the saws remotely over these platforms that I was talking about.
Got it. So there's nobody that's actually in there.
They're not going to be on top of the saw, no.
Not on top of it, but are they inside the reactor?
I'm sorry?
Are they in the reactor or are they inside?
No. They'll be on the platform, and that's why I need that working platform, right, so they can control the saw.
And how are they protected from any nuclear?
The dose rates will have the cavity filled to the top with water, just like we do for every refueling of it.
Rich, I think that answers my question, which is, so you flood it up, but then as you cut it down, you reduce the amount of water, right? Is that the way it works?
We're probably going to cut the vessel dry. Everything internal to the vessel, right, will be cut underwater. But it comes a point in time where you have to cut the vessel dry, because if you don't, then you'll just flood out the whole containment building.
Okay.
Anything else on segmentation? Okay, let's go to building demolition. I mean, again, since March 17th, when I talked to the Oversight Board, we talked about building demolition activities, and they are in progress, along with several tanks no longer needed to support the facility. So our concentration is really on those tanks and buildings outside the protected area, just for ease of access for the demo crews. And then following a fuel on pad protected, when the protected area shrinks for the site, we'll have more access or easier access to some of the larger buildings. So with that said, since our last Oversight Board meeting, we demoed a security checkpoint building that was used for Unit 3 years ago. That's been removed. The number 11 fuel oil storage tank is demolished, and we're placing that metal into containers. And the gas turbine oil tank, again, I'll show you pictures here, that's been cleaned and ready for demo. The other major contractor on site is Champion. They've been doing most of this demo work, and we've had no issues with them either. So they're working out well. Projected activities through the end of July, it's going to be the number 12 fuel oil storage tank. We've already started taking that down. The gas turbine complex, which is actually across the street. It used to house gas turbines back in the day that no longer used for many years. We're going to take that down. Then we have some metal enclosures or metal buildings. One was a Unit 3 hazardous waste building. I don't want to get people alarmed about that any fluorescent light or any waste oil or any cleaners or what we called hazardous waste. We'll clean out that building accordingly, and then we'll take it down. The training center firewater storage tank and its diesel, we need to remove that to support storing some of our radioactive waste before it gets shipped. And then one warehouse, and then we have actually a boathouse that we store a boat in. So if we turn the page, next slide. Top left was the security shack that we took down, and you could see that's down by the blank picture next to it. Next slide. So this is the big building demo that we're doing so far. That's number 11 tank. It's been there. It used to house number 6 oil that was used to superheat steam in Unit 1 years ago. So right now, we've cut that all up. We're putting the pieces. Before we cut it, we had Clean Harbors come in and clean out the tanks accordingly. So we are cutting up the steel now and shipping that steel out. Next slide. That's the next tank we'll hit. That was a diesel oil tank that we use for our emergency diesels. That was part of our tech specs that we required that tank. That tank's been cleaned, right, and it's ready to come down. That'll come down next after number 12 fuel oil tank. Next slide. That's the next tank will come down. It doesn't look like that right now. It's just about, I'd say, halfway done, right? And we should finish that up over the next 2 weeks. Next slide. That's the gas turbine complex that's across the street from us, right next to the switch yard, the Buchanan switch yard that's owned by Edison. All right, so that'll be the next project that we take to take all those buildings down. Those are all metal buildings. There's no concrete there. Next slide. That's the hazardous waste building we're taking down. Again, another metal enclosure. And then the next slide is the fire water storage tank for the training building that we're no longer using. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so we're taking down that tank also, right? And that'll help us with loading some of our waste casks into a flex building. So that's all I have for building demo through the end of July. We have a schedule in place to take down additional structures, not all the buildings though, but we have a schedule in place through the third quarter of 2024. I talked last time about the domes. We're still on a 10 to 12 year projected time frame to take those down. But I just want to be clear that we are taking buildings down external to some of the larger buildings around the site. So that's going pretty well right now. That's all I have on building demo, pending any questions. All right, so we touched upon this briefly before in the meeting. These are basically the exemption requests that we have placed with the NRC. So the exemption process is in accordance with 10 CFR 5011, right, which is entitled Exceptions and Exemptions for licensing requirements, and then it kicks you out to 10 CFR 5012. Most of these are, let's see, I'd say 3 out of the 5 are really based on the Zerk fire window. So what's that? The Zerk fire window is a period of time where you can lose, you can expose the fuel in your spent fuel pool for 10 hours without a Zerk fire reaction. So zircaloy metal is the metal that's used to encapsulate the fuel pellets in a fuel assembly. So based on the Zerk fire calculations, right now, actually it's August 1st of this year is when we meet that 10-year requirement. So none of these dates reflect August 1st because when we submit the LARs, we have a discussion with the NRC. They have a workload schedule, much like any one of us. So what they project is the return dates based on their review cycle. Now I understand the state reviews these also, and they may object to them. So we'll just follow the process, and we'll see what the NRC says at the end of the day.
And Rich, this is John Sipos, just one clarification. I think you said 10-year. I think you meant 10-hour.
We'll meet the
On the Zerk, I think it was on the window. You said it was a 10-year.
The Zerk fire window says.
Right.
Now you got me confused, John. The Zerk fire window says that you can expose your fuel, right, for 10 hours without a Zerk fire reaction. Not 10, did I say 10 years?
I think at one point you inadvertently probably did.
I apologize for that, right? So we'll meet that 10-hour requirement come August 1st. So really, the actuality of this, right, is if the NRC had additional resources and they approved the exemption request, we can go into the PDEP August 1st. But they don't have the resources to meet that requirement. So, any questions on NRC inspections and activity?
Yeah, I mean, this is Richard here. So the thing I find strange about this exemption thing is that people talk about them as though the NRC regulations are like ridiculously tight, and so therefore we need an exemption. I guess that isn't my experience. So can you motivate a little bit more, particularly on emergency planning,
Sure.
why you'd want to go
exemption process
worse
is-
than the NRC regulations?
We're not the only plant in the
No, I know.
country that's filing exemptions,
I know, are all plants exceptional?
right? All plants are doing it.
Are they all exceptional? Are they all exceptional?
They're a little exceptional.
Are they all exceptional?
I can't answer that question for all of them.
In other words, don't you agree with me that a regulation should only, an exemption should only be granted when there's an exceptional circumstance?
I could just tell you this. We're following a process. We're following a process that the NRC gives us to file these exemptions.
I
The state
understand.
has all the right in the world to comment on those and push back. And I'm sure they will, right? But at the end of the day, it's the NRC who will grant the exemption or not.
Right, but Ms. Maroney, you know, we have citizens here in the room and we have them on the line. They look at this and say, this is crazy. And you're not really helping, honestly. You're just saying the NRC will give it to us, so we want it.
I didn't say they'll give it to us. I said they'll review it.
Well, you're saying if the NRC will give it to us, we'll take it. But why don't you tell the citizens why they'll still be safe?
What I tell the citizens is this, is that we need to understand there's a paradigm shift here, right? We're going from power operation to decommissioning, right? It'll take 10 hours, right, for no fuel in the pool to have a Zerk reaction.
Correct.
Right? Hold on, let me finish, right? I'm confident we have procedures in place, right, that if anything were to happen to those pools, we'll get water in the pool, right, by procedure, right? So then we won't have the Zerk fire reaction. Those are the rules, right? And that's what every other nuclear plant in this country follows. They follow all these, they follow 10 CFR 50.
But aren't the regulations written for defueled reactors?
I'm sorry?
Aren't those regulations that you're trying to get an exemption from written for defueled reactors?
All reactors are defueled.
I know, so why don't you follow the NRC rules?
Because the NRC, they want to change all the exemption requests. They don't want to see exemption requests either. They want to do a whole rule change, but that's getting reviewed now too. We're not doing anything different than any other nuclear plant in this country is doing. And so we need to recognize the paradigm shift.
I guess what we're saying is don't go to the lowest common denominator, be the best in the country.
Anybody clapping for me? Okay, I guess.
I don't think so, no.
I'm just telling you what the rules are, right?
I know what the rules are.
Okay, fine.
But I still don't know why you want to do this. I mean, that's what I don't understand. You have got plenty of money in the
That's a good
decommissioning
question,
fund.
right? Right, so we're taking on all the risk. Holtec is taking on all the risk, and they're telling you, we'll get this facility back to the village, to the town of Portland in 12 to 15 years. If we want to keep all of these rules in place, that's not going to happen, right? So don't you want the acreage to come back to the village, to come back to the town, so they can repurpose it to build up their tax base?
With respect,
in a safe manner.
With respect, I think your cost estimate showed that you'd have a surplus if you bring this in
Right.
at budget. You'd have a surplus of around $400 million.
And we're taking on
And
all
I'm
the risk.
asking you, use
I don't
it-
see anybody else taking the risk.
I'm
to take
asking
the
you,
units
use
now.
a little bit of that surplus to keep the emergency planning going.
Okay, fine. I understand your comment.
But
But I'll tell you also, Holtec is taking on all the risk to take these buildings down.
Well-
I don't see anybody else volunteering to do that.
Okay, if the decommissioning fund runs out of money, who will replenish it?
I don't think it will. That's what the,
Yeah, no, but if
that's
it
what
will-
the whole due diligence is
But
about.
you're saying you're taking all the risk. If the decommissioning fund runs out of money, who will replenish it?
Well, let me ask you a question. If you don't allow us these exemption requests, there's a higher chance of we'll run out of money than we won't.
Are you saying if you don't get that request, you'll run out of money?
I'm just saying it allows us to do this decommissioning in a shorter time frame.
You haven't shown that at all. If you can show that, that'd be interesting. But why don't you come back and show why that's
You know
true?
what? We can agree to disagree. That's fine.
No, these are facts. You're telling me facts.
Yeah, I'm telling you
It's not an
facts.
opi- is that an
I'm
opinion
telling
or a
you,
fact?
the facts is this, right? In accordance with the federal regulations, we're allowed to file exemption requests.
I know that.
And if, I can't help it if people don't like that. We're within the regulations and the requirements of the NRC.
No, we never.
You may not like that, and that's fine. I understand your opposition.
What I'm saying is, you have a choice here, it seems to me, right? You have a choice. You could either meet the NRC regulations for defueled reactors on emergency planning, or you can file an exemption request,
Right.
right? And what I'm asking you is, why have you decided to file an exemption request? As far as I can tell, it's because you want to save money.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we're taking all the risk.
We could,
I don't see anybody else taking the risk here.
well,
Right?
with respect,
No, you're not.
with respect,
You're gonna,
with respect.
we don't want to argue, do we?
and I don't want to argue either, but I just want to say, look,
I'll still go on
the
your boat,
community-
trust me.
The community live around the plant. They want it done as safely as possible. I just ask you to have a think about how you're doing it.
Okay, fine.
Richard, I think we have that all established, and it's the mantra of the safe decommissioning and site restoration. So I hear it from you, and I hear it from many people, you have issues with the NRC. So the way we handle that is we go to our elected officials on the federal level, and if we want to see change from the NRC, then we need to go to the federal people who have not really been involved in this whole process. Crickets, and for years. So I think the people that have a problem with the NRC, please, because we come to these local meetings all the time, please, please, please go to the federal officials and vent your frustrations there with that. Because, you know, yes, fortunately, we have the state overseeing this too, but I constantly hear the NRC, but you know what? Nothing's going to get done if you want to see change there unless we go to their bosses.
Yeah, but Holtec are here, they're the ones making this choice.
Well, then the NRC will approve it or not.
Correct.
You know what I'm saying? So, but if we have a problem with the NRC procedures, like say if they do the exemptions and the people who are anti-NRC, then, you know, we can't keep beating the same drum. We have to go to the NRC or to their bosses and say, look, we're not happy with X, Y, Z.
Right.
And plus, especially now with the rule changes too that are going through.
I hear Teresa, I think we need to do
I
both.
just,
Yeah.
you know, it's just, you know, it's just I constantly hear it, and it's like,
Yeah.
if we want change, then we have to make change happen.
Agreed.
Listen, I'm not
Richard
here
and
to
I
argue.
agreed on something. I want to note that tonight. I want that on record.
I'm not here to argue. I'm just telling you the rules that we're following.
Well, Rich,
right?
and
I can understand that you're not in compliance with that. I understand, but I'm just telling you, you know, we're doing what every other nuclear plant in this country is doing.
look, and Rich, you acknowledged as well, we're going to disagree. And there's a venue at the NRC for us to make our case on the
Absolutely.
facts and on the merits, and that's what we'll do. I take Teresa's point as well with respect to NRC rules, where we have problems with those to work with our federal partners. I think we need to move it along, doing a time check.
raised his hand.
Oh, he did? Dave, you want to give it a shot? Thank you, Courtney. Dave, if you can hear us, you can try to chime in.
I think we can't hear him.
These regulations are designed for operating reactors, not fueled reactors. That's why Holtec and everybody else has to get exemptions. The regulations really don't apply to that situation. The NRC started its rulemaking process in 2015, and they're still not done with it. They basically put it on a shelf for several years for reasons unknown, and that's what's forcing everybody into these awkward situations because the NRC's not doing its job.
Tried everything. Dave, we heard a portion of that. I'm sorry, there's a big echo, and you know we've got a presentation that's supposed to be made virtually as well. I think our AV technical staff is going to try to turn the mics off here for that part of the presentation. If it doesn't work, we're going to have to apologize to our friends at Columbia, and we may not be able to proceed. So, Tom Carey, go ahead.
I'm just curious if any of the presenters online have something that they can email to somebody here that we could read off, if
That's
that
a
would help.
terrific idea, Tom. Thank you. Hey, Dave Lockbaum, if you could just put your comments into an email to John Sipos, John will read that in to the record here. We really appreciate that. And I'm very sorry to everyone in the audience and online for these technical difficulties.
Is the speaker on that computer turned on? Because it should only, the microphone should be on that computer, that you've got that microphone pointed to?
If the AV team could please come out and do a check here.
Because that's what creates the echo, is that the
Yeah.
speaker, the microphone's picking up the speaker from the computer and the the microphone on the computer.
We'll check on that.
You're getting some advice up here on the advice out here
I think that's the way to keep the meeting short.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do, like, if Dave will call you, and then you can put your phone, you can speak through your phone. I don't know if somebody could do that, because we do that too at Village Works.
Just a nightmare. They tested it last week.
Dave,
Appreciate
if you
everyone's
wanna
patience while we test
give them-
out some new approaches here, see if we can get this working. And while we're waiting, just as a time check for the group, either the Columbia students will be able to present in a way where we can hear it, or they won't. If they can't, and we can't hear it, we'll cancel that portion of the meeting. But if they can, I'm going to recommend that we postpone the emergency preparedness presentation until another meeting, because we're an hour over, and I don't want to short shrift the community guest speaker or the public statement portion of the meeting. Is that all right with the group? One or the other parts of the presentation are going to have to be postponed.
Dave, we're going to try you one more time here, if you can try speaking again.
Yes, this is Dave Lockbaum. I was just commenting that in August of 1999, the NRC staff identified 34 sections of their regulations that did not apply to permanently shut down reactors. But they did nothing with that knowledge for decades. It wasn't until 2015 that they started a rulemaking process to correct all those known problems. Then the NRC suspended that effort after collecting comments from the industry and the public and the states and so on, and they're still not done with that. As a result, Holtec and other owners are being forced to seek exemptions to rules that the NRC knows don't apply during decommissioning. It's an awkward process for everybody, but the bad guy in the town is the NRC, who simply doesn't do their job.
Thank you, Dave. Rich, do you want to continue?
Just the last slide. And so on this last slide, really it was, okay, really, the last slide just talks to correspondence we've had with multiple state agencies. So there's multiple bullets here, but so you've gone over most of them. I'll just go over 3 of them real quick. We did work extensively with the Columbia grad students on the BV school monitoring program. We're happy to help. We want to work on at least a air monitoring system and some type of radiation monitoring system. So we'll continue to work with them and get that installed. We are working on a property allowance south of the plant for the town of Cortland for access to a future recreation facility. We're happy to help there. And then the last bullet I'll bring up is...
Rich, if you hold, please. Advance the slides, please. Joe, I'm speaking into the mic. If you could advance the slides, please. I really don't know who has the presentation. It's not working. The slides aren't advancing.
Rich, while we're waiting for the slides, maybe I can ask you one last question. I promise. Last question.
Please.
You're going to handshake at the end of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I know that there is a number of operating experience sharing organizations like INPO and so forth for operating reactors. Is there such an organisation for decommissioning? And if so, is Holtec a member?
Yeah, absolutely. OTEC's doing a lot of that. So they obviously, right, let's just be honest here, there were a lot of issues at Diablo Canyon when they were doing some of their defueling, right? So from that operating experience, they totally revised our procedures. Before Holtec came on, we cast 54 casks with our procedures. But when they came on, they noticed that, hey, all these problems we're having, these procedures need to be enhanced. So just from that operating experience alone, they totally revised our offload procedures. We never had an issue, and they just enhanced them even more based on operating experience.
Right, and that was internal Holtec operating experience, right?
Yeah. Well, plus we haven't stopped the corrective action process either, which
Right.
looks at operating experience from other facilities, right? So we have that, and I have an individual that mines operating experience, and we'll talk about it at least twice, 3 times a week.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, so this last slide, you covered most of these bullets up front, but I'll just cover the first one and the last 2, and I'll cover the last one last, the first one last. So we've worked extensively with the Columbia grad students. We're happy to help. So we'll come up with, through what they were recommending, we'll look at the proper monitoring program for the BV school. It'll look at particulate, and they called it VOX, which was greases and oils and stuff like that. I'm sorry?
Volatile organic.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Peter. And so we'll work with that. And then we want to try to install some type of real-time online RAD monitoring system to avoid cartridges being sent out. I think some type of real-time monitoring system would be better. So we'll work with them on that. The last bullet, we're working on property allowance for south of the plant, right, for the town of Cortland to have access to a new recreation facility that they're looking at. So I left the first bullet for last because I know there's passion here. So we did sign an MOU with Holtec, yeah, with Enbridge on the gas lines that go through the site. All right, and I'll specifically, I think it's important that I read this so everybody's on the same page. It was signed off by myself and Mr. Wooden, who is the vice president at Algonquin. So it notes the following, right? During the term, as defined below, and the term is 1 year. So long as the steel plates remain in their current place, the 5-day advance notice described in Section 1D of the joint proposal shall not be required for any heavy load pipeline crossing. Where possible, if heavy load pipeline crossings using the steel plate can be avoided and an alternate traffic pattern can be employed, HDI is committed to do so. HDI site engineering will perform weekly inspections to ensure the configuration of the air bridge remains unchanged. These inspections will be captured in HDI's corrective action program, which it is. So I have an engineer going up there once a week at least. Algonquin will perform periodic inspections of the air bridge, and should a change to the air bridge configuration be seen, it shall immediately notify HDI of the change. If configuration change were to occur, this has been noticed by, if configuration change were to occur that has been noticed by HDI or Algonquin, all traffic across the air bridge will immediately cease until corrections are made by HDI to Algonquin's satisfaction. Any loads crossing the 26 and 30-inch pipelines that are in excess of 136,000 pounds gross weight will require that HDI provide Algonquin 5 days advance notice of such crossing. Within 5 days of such notification from HDI, Algonquin shall provide a written response to HDI either approving of the crossing or requesting any necessary modifications. Nothing in this MOU is intended to alter HDI or other notice obligations under the joint proposal, including providing required notices to the New York Department of Public Service and Algonquin for other activities being performed in proximity to the pipeline. So just let me add something real quick, Rick, that when we were taking down the fuel oil tanks, we did contact Algonquin just to make sure they had no issues with us doing that, and we got the approval from them. So the term, this MOU is effective of the effective date and shall terminate after 1 year. The parties may agree to extend the term for an additional 1-year period in a writing signed by both parties and upon terms agreeable to the parties. And so we were happy to put this MOU in place. We have recently spoken to Enbridge about a modification, a permanent modification to the steel plate. They still came back with us using the steel plates plus some underground changes. I don't like that. I think we can go further and put a more robust system in to avoid steel plates in the future. So we're still working with them, but I think it's important that we know that we have continuing dialogue with Enbridge to make this issue be resolved long term. Also, we have periodic meetings with the state and Enbridge, and that's been proven to be pretty good, opening the lines of communication. That's all I have for
Thank you, Rich.
correspondence, and if there are any other questions.
Any questions?
So,
Sandy?
Rich, since you read that into the record, I would assume we can all get a copy of it in the
Sure.
public too?
We'll post it online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Rich? Okay. Let me just say, the technical difficulties we're having are profoundly embarrassing, and I'm very sorry to the audience for these difficulties. It's got to be an enormously stressful time for our technical team, so I want to be kind, but we will obviously get to the bottom of this to ensure it doesn't happen again, and hopefully we'll simply do our meetings entirely in person. In their defense, they recommended against doing a hybrid meeting for this very reason. We insisted on trying to accommodate it. They tested it last week. It worked. It's obviously not working tonight. So I'm very sorry. But with that said, I'm going to skip the presentation on emergency preparedness. We were able to hear, I'm sorry, before I get to that, we're going to accelerate on the agenda the public statement portion of the meeting. We'll start with those individuals who are here in person. I'm going to ask Tom Kazmarek to facilitate that if he's able, to take the list of people in the order in which they registered. Tom?
Thanks, Tom. I hope everyone can hear me okay here.
We can.
Let me try my computer.
You got it.
Thank you. Okay, so can everyone hear me clearly? Okay. So individuals who did register ahead of the meeting will be given an opportunity to speak. You should have received a card when you arrived telling you what order you'll be presenting in, but in case not, let me just, Miss Marilyn Ellie, if you're in the audience, you're the first
She's
speaker.
not here.
She's not. Marie and Sarah is next. Marie, if you'd like to come up to the podium here, and just while she's coming up to the microphone, just a reminder, there will be a 3-minute time limit for each speaker. We will begin with those in person, and we'll see if it allows for those joining remotely later. But with that, again, Miss and Sarah, you're welcome to begin.
Okay, thank you. My name is Marie and Sarah. I live in Peekskill. I'm a member of several environmental organizations. I guess the first question, in light of the previous discussion, that did get a little heated, reasonably so, I'd question whether a congressional representative can be involved in these meetings on a regular basis. I know we're in a state of upheaval right now in terms of Congressman Jones continuing as our representative, but I think that would be an appropriate addition. And I think I just want to reiterate concerns over a number of the details involved in decommissioning that we have discussed before regarding the use of the thin wall casks when Europe is using far thicker casks, especially given the fact that those seem to be utilized because of the, quote, transportability, and I have serious concerns that the idea of transporting radioactive material via rail or water past all the municipalities that it would pass by, I don't see that that's ever going to be something that people will accept. So if they're going to be on site, basically indefinitely, then maybe a more robust task would be the better choice. Thanks.
Thank you. Susan?
I just want to say that Jerry Shapiro from Senator Gillibrand's office has been participating in every one of these meetings.
Thank you, Susan.
All right, next up, we have John Sullivan.
Thank you for having us. Just 3 quick questions before I start. Tom, you talked about the question and answers. That's from the previous meeting that was posted 2 weeks ago, whatever.
Yes.
And for John Sipos, I'm assuming that the DOB will make known which agencies are dealing with the exemptions from the state level, as well as the NRC. You said the state agencies, so I
Yes.
take it there's several.
So the short
obviously
answer to your
Homeland Security, DEC.
the short answer to your question is yes, it will be made known as to what state agencies are involved. Sometimes there are individual state agencies, sometimes there's a consortium, and oftentimes they are facilitated through the New York State Energy Research Development Agency. Elise Peterson is here. And so there are a variety of ways that comments go in. And when the comments go in, they can be publicized.
Okay, all right, thank you. And the other one is for Rich, and it was just that the understanding is the 10-hour window, Zyrtec window?
Zircaloy fire.
Right. That means that the rods can be exposed for 10 hours outside of water before there's a concern of fire?
Rich, why don't you come on up to the mic?
So the Zerk fire window says this.
Zerk.
It says you can expose your fuel in the spent fuel pool for 10 hours without the zircaloy cladding of the fuel assembly degrading. Right? So
You're exposing it to what? I don't get that.
if the level in the spent fuel pool.
The water level.
So if the water goes
There's
down.
23 feet of water
Right.
on top of the on top of the fuel assemblies now.
Right.
Right? If I start losing that water and I expose the fuel,
Okay,
right? I come to a point in time where for 10 hours I can expose that assembly
Right.
without it degrading.
okay.
And so that's the Zerk fire window, that's what we
Right.
call it.
And you're exposing it to the air.
Correct.
Otherwise, the water aids in keeping the thing together. Okay, all right, that was the question. I had to prepare a statement. Basically, it's just thanking you guys for all the work that you do. I'm asking you to somehow try to fit in, instead of a public comment section, that you fit in a question and answer for each presentation, because we are left with a lot of unanswered questions, mysterious sorts of things, especially with Rich and all the procedures that go on. And I think that was pretty much it. Just our hope that is the public becomes more educated and engaged as we go along. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Courtney Williams.
I'm going to keep this super short because I'm going to be presenting later. I had a specific question in the memorandum of understanding that you just read to us. Did it say that if you keep the plates in place, you no longer need to do the 5 days notification to Enbridge? Wasn't the joint agreement that that had to be in place, and can Enbridge and Holtec just decide to not comply?
So there's a limit, and you'll see this when we post the MOU. There was a weight limit that was identified by Enbridge for the crossings, and an agreement that the steel plates were sufficient to carry that load. And so for any load that's below that weight limit, the notice is deemed to have been made. If they had a crossing that exceeded that limit, the notification would get triggered, and that would have to be reviewed to determine if the mitigation measures were still sufficient.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm also participating on WebEx, so I can ask my questions into the chat, but I'm also in touch with community members who are very much in favor of you guys figuring out how to make hybrid work, because we still have folks that are not able to attend in person, and they would like the opportunity to continue to participate that way. And then the other is, when we get presentations from Holtec, it would be really great to have subject matter expert that could compare and contrast their proposed plans with best practices, because I think and Richard brought up some of this, I think the public is not always aware of what is the best practice for this process, and we need to make sure to educate them that what Holtec wants to do, their decisions are based on financials and not public safety. So there should be a voice that makes clear what best practices would entail so that the public can adequately advocate for that. And I would also like to strongly object to the idea that it is Holtec that is assuming the risks for decommissioning Indian Point. Because if the SHIT hits the fan, it is most definitely the taxpayers that are going to be holding the bag. And that comment set my phone on fire from other parents in the school district with children at Buchanan Verplank Elementary, 4,000 feet from the containment zone, and from other community members who are engaged in this process. So that's really absurd, because both with our health, with our safety, and with our pocketbooks, we are assuming that risk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Susan Van Dulsen. Is Susan with us tonight?
I think Susan is on.
Okay.
Let's stay within person for now.
Yes, Amanda Jo?
Thank you. If you can see me over the dais. Manager Green, I'm the Environmental Director for Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, and I've been following this process for the 20 years that I've been at Clearwater, intensely since 9/11. I just have a couple of things. First of all, I want to say that this is a national model. The Decommissioning Oversight Board in New York is the envy of the rest of the country that has reactor communities. And with that comes a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of opportunity for good communication and the best possible outcome. This discussion about the exemption request, I think, needs to be a clear presentation. I only got the information today, and I've read through it a couple times, and I don't understand it, and I have good background to understand it. So perhaps Dave Lockbaum, at the next meeting, could go over that. That's a suggestion. The other question I have is about the resident inspector and when they will be hired and brought on. And then I just want to say again, because I wasn't able to attend the meeting, but I think Assemblywoman Galiff expressed her concern about the workers that had been promised to be kept on. Not only is it a question of a just transition, but it's also a question of the institutional memory that the workers that had been at the plant as long as they have, and the value that that could have provided. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I expect to repeat it many times, that facility is ideal for a transition to a renewable energy economy. And Mayor is shaking her head.
Yeah, because we've had the conversation about the solar panels and things like that. You know what? This property hasn't been accessible to the public for 60 years. So, and what we're understanding with solar panels, unless they could put them on top rooftops like they did with our sheetrock plant, but to take up that property, that whole property, which you would need substantial amount of property, would be a waste. And not only that, for the community that's hurting with this closure, they wouldn't get the return that they really need and deserve to have. So we've had that discussion before about solar panels.
Okay, let me just finish my thought.
Okay, sure. No, I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay. I don't think that from the PSDAR that this site will be cleaned up enough for public use. And that's why the fact that the grid infrastructure is in place, if you combined solar with battery backup, I think that would be an ideal future use, because if I thought that it could be cleaned up to a standard for a higher use, but also we really need to meet the goals of the Climate Act, and that will include the need for vast amount of renewable energy with storage to ensure reliability. And I think I probably used my 3 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, for in-person, is Tina Volsbonger.
And I just want to say, while Tina's coming up, that the future use of the property is still, we'll know in 10 to 12 years. So, thank you.
It'll be the subject of many more discussions.
Meetings. Yes,
Many
Tom,
more meetings.
yes.
Welcome,
Indeed.
thank you.
Hi, welcome. I'm from Peekskill, and I am a climate reality leader trained by Al Gore. So after I deliver this very dismal message about the climate, I say, as he does, here's the good news. We can do something about it, okay? So I am very interested in what our emergency response is going to be, because many of us living in the community, and Ms. Knickerbocker, I've been dying to tell you this for years.
Okay.
I can see Indian Point from my second floor window, even though I live in Peekskill. My mother has in her living room and thing, we live with Indian Point. So anyway, and here's the good news, we can do something about it. And what I wanted to say is that here we have an emergency response, but we don't have a risk assessment. Right now on the docket, and you're all members of the Decommissioning Oversight Board, there's 1,080 letters on the docket. Have you read them? Okay, most of them tell you to shut down the pipeline while dangerous decommissioning activities are happening. And Ms. Knickerbocker, they're addressed to Pete Buttigieg. We are working with...
The transportation, who's the head of transportation, who's responsible for the pipeline.
Who is responsible.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
when you say do the advocacy, we are on it.
No, I'm
and you
glad.
may not hear that at public meetings and everything, but we are on it. And the issue that we have is that not many other agencies are, because they say, that's out of our jurisdiction. And you know this, Mr. Sipos, you know this, Tom Condon, because I've asked you, begged you, really. You can do something about this. Please do. And anyway, so when we understand what is going to be the emergency response, it's got to include the co-location emergency response, a vapor cloud, and how a vapor cloud would impact those rods. On my tour of Indian Point, I happened to tell you this, that I lost somebody that I knew in 9/11. And the risk assessment for those buildings is that a plane could hit them, and they could. But they did not assess the jet fuel taking that steel down. And so we owe it to ourselves to have the proper federal risk assessment, please. And that is something everybody on this committee can do. You can tell Jerry Shapiro and Mondaire Jones, and I know you do that, Assemblymember Galiff, and I'm so grateful. And if I haven't told you enough, I'm grateful for you doing that. And anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you. And you can do something about this.
Tom, do you want to try any of the speakers that are online?
I think we can, you mean public speakers?
Right.
Or, we can give it a try. Just give me a moment. A little bit of triage
We're going to, there are others that signed up for the public statement portion, and then we're going to go straight to the students. For those of you listening in online, we're going to attempt to call on members of the community who requested to provide a statement. We'll try it with the first person, and if it doesn't work, we'll then attempt to go to the next item on the agenda, which will be the presentation from Columbia, which will also be virtual. So we'll test that out.
Okay. Joe, would you be able to test out your audio here and introduce the speakers who are joining remotely?
Sure, no problem. Can you hear me okay?
It's very quiet, Joe.
Can you hear me okay, Tom?
Yes, that's good. Yep.
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that. I made a few attempts to. So the first person I see is Jacqueline Dreschler. Is that correct? Did I say that correct? Let me see if I can unmute her.
They switched the screen to show the people instead of the timer. That would be good. Thought I saw them before. No. Ashley.
Refreshing it. I cannot unlock the speaker for some reason. It's not allowing me to. Let me see if there's a setting.
Can you hear me?
There you are.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, thanks for having this hearing. Unfortunately, there's 14 minutes missing where everything went dead, and then other minutes missing. So I hope this was recorded. So
Can you speak? Can you please give your name for the court reporters?
Yes, it's Jacqueline Drexler. I live in Valley Cottage, New York. I'm also speaking for my twin sister, Jocelyn DiCrescenzo. Did you hear what I said at the very beginning?
We did, yes. Thank you very much. And I apologize for interrupting.
Well, and was this recorded? Because there's 14 minutes missing from the middle of this entire presentation. Hello?
We have a court reporter, and the meeting is being recorded. Given the technical difficulties, I can't make any promises.
Of this so that I can find those missing minutes. It's kind of like Watergate. Okay, so back on March 25th, I was on a Texas call with Donald Habib from the NRC and a whole bunch of other people regarding Holtec, who was asking for an exemption request, an emergent exemption request on a certificate of compliance to not inspect welds on cask they found a 1-inch leak. So I'm really concerned about exemptions. And that's number one. Number two, I do believe that I've also heard that Holtec is planning on dumping radioactive wastewater into Cape Cod Bay. And I wanted to just say that this is not acceptable. We know if they get away with doing that, they're going to do it here. And the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, a fellow from there, has said that the testing of water needs to be before, during, and after releases, and testing must be done well and independently. And, quote, you need some assurance that Holtec doesn't take the sample out of a rain barrel, because that's what one could do. So I'm also very upset that this whole issue of line of sight and berms is being totally dismissed by Mr. Baroni? Mr. Baroni, I just have to say, I think that your dismissal of Richard Webster's discussion about that, and you're flat out saying there's no room, and the fact that you totally dismissed going out on a boat to see what we're talking about is just so rude. I cannot believe you. I'm very concerned about where the disposal items are going to be disposed of. And so that's for starters. I know I don't have much time left, but I'm very concerned about the emergency planning and the fact that there never seems to be any. I'm also totally infuriated by Holtec's actually admitting on this call that they are just in it for the money, because that's what they said. And I'm also concerned that there was no chat, no participant list, no helpline number to call. I don't know why you continue to use WebEx when the whole world uses Zoom very easily, because this has been the most unprofessional and incompetent hearing I've ever participated in. These get worse and worse and worse. And I'm sorry I have to say that, but that's what's happening. It's been the most frustrating experience, and I'm really upset with especially this other lady also being dismissive. I don't even know her name because people aren't introducing themselves, and I don't have any video to see of anyone who's speaking. So I'm in the dark here, and I'm very concerned about that. Thank you.
Joe, who's next, please?
I'm looking to see who's here. I'm not able to search them for some reasons, but I'm looking.
Joe, can you go to Susan Van Dulsen next, please?
Susan, what is the last name, please?
Van Dulsen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thanks for holding the meeting, and I will reiterate what others have said. Here we are trying to avoid getting COVID. I had breast cancer this year, and I did not want to attend in person. And I don't think it's very nice when people say, well, hopefully next time everyone will come in person, because some people cannot or choose not to. So you have to improve your system. This is not user-friendly. That's an understatement. But anyway, thank you now for allowing me to speak. I was preparing other things to say, but after hearing Mr. Baroni, I have to say it's been extremely disappointing. These exemptions that are being requested, after reading the article recently in the Washington Post about Holtec's practices and what's been going on elsewhere, and then his attitude tonight about, who's taking risk? Well, the public is taking more risk than you are. It's your money, but it's our lives. Like, this is unbelievable, the attitude. I feel as if they're cutting every corner. It's all the things we've been worrying about when we heard Holtec was going to do the decommissioning. And here we are, hearing a gentleman at a meeting where he's supposed to reassure us, admitting that all they want to do is hurry up and get the site back so people can use it, when we know very well it's going to take many, many, many years, if ever. And there's toxic, spent fuel there. In fact, in the article, in the Washington Post, it says some nuclear safety advocates are saying the NRC is being too deferential to Holtec. Years of research shows plants are still vulnerable to a disaster after they shut down. In staff reports, the NRC has said severe accidents can result from mishandling spent fuel rods, and that sites storing nuclear waste remain vulnerable to sabotage. We need to address all the vulnerabilities and not dismiss it and say that Holtec is taking risk because of money. What a disgusting way to look at this. How can we go to these meetings and be reassured that we're being thought, people who live here are being cared about at all? The arrogance is just beyond me. I don't know what else to say. NRC is very much a captured agency. We all know that. And Holtec, in this article and all the things I've read about Holtec for years now, I have no confidence and I'm terrified. So thanks for letting me speak. I don't know if I can attend these meetings anymore. The frustration level and stress is just too much. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we're actually going to move on to the next portion of the meeting. We're turning it over to two gentlemen.
We have another speaker.
Yes, is
yes,
Marilyn Ellie on the line? She was
okay.
registered to
I
speak.
apologize. Ruben and Santiago, if you can hear me, can you try unmuting? I believe I just gave you the presentation controls.
That's right, yeah, I can hear you. Do I sound all right on your end?
Yes, we can hear you.
Santi, you want to give it a try?
Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear me? Right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
Perfect. So let's go in the name of the time. First of all, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to all of you. And we're going to present you about the risk assessment and monitoring plan for Buchanan Burplank Elementary School. We are students from Columbia University, and we're part of the Master in Science in Sustainable Science program. And this project, it's about our spring capstone that we were working through 3 months to achieve this final presentation. So to begin with, let us show you our team. The next slide, please. Okay, thank you. And there's me, our team that is Santiago Oliva, and we're a team of 8 people who worked for 3 months really hard to present a document that we already sent a draft to the DOB. We're finishing the final version, and the team was confirmed by Wasfia Hawk, Ruben Goh, who is presenting with me, Margaret George, Tao Tran, Tinus Venter, Henry Ko, and Yuli. So let's go to the project. First of all, the project scope, that is our concerns, our work, and what we were asked to. As the context of this meeting, the activity of concern is Indian Point, the commissioning process, and our location of concern is Buchanan Burplank Elementary School. So everything we have written, everything we had doing some research, it's thinking in the Buchanan Burplank Elementary School, specific to that. And the intended deliverable is the identification of contaminants, a hazard assessment of individual contaminants, a monitoring plan, and contaminant-specific policy recommendations. Considering we don't have 3 hours to present everything, we're going to focus this presentation in the monitoring plan and contaminant-specific policy recommendations. And just to tell you how we got to the monitoring plan, we did a risk assessment, a reduced risk assessment, that we identified the contaminants of concern, we identified the human exposure pathway. Later, we assessed the contaminant toxicity, and we assessed the human contaminant intakes. And this methodology, we get to 5 contaminants of concern that we will call them COCs. From now, that they are radiation that could affect the community, the particulate matter, PM, volatile organic compounds, asbestos and fiberglass, and lead. And something really important about this contaminant of concern, that the selection operates on a precautionary principle. What does it mean, a precautionary principle? That we want to be preventive. We don't want to wait that there is like a high-risk contamination to start measuring this contaminant. We want to keep measuring them, so if there is any accident, we are controlling these variables. So, already chosen the contaminants of concern, we went to a plan of action, that we developed a plan with 3 monitoring scenarios to monitor the COCs both inside and outside the school buildings. And why 3 monitoring scenarios? Because we are going to provide this to the decision making so they can consider the variables and choose the best pathway. Later, we evaluated the relevant technologies for all the contaminants of concern. We evaluated the effectiveness, the data accessibility, the cost and maintenance. We adopted a cautionary, conservative, a preemptive approach. Remember the precautionary principle. This is because we want to be preemptive. And we recommend monitoring plans based on risk to human health, effectiveness, implementability, and costs. So what are the 3 monitoring scenarios that we will be discussing later. The first one is business as usual, that is the least amount of effort and cost. Business as usual considers that we are doing the same efforts that we are doing today. That means Holtec, radiation monitoring, this is the air quality monitoring, this is the 6 months of monitoring the school. It doesn't mean no effort, it means that we continue with the current efforts that are being done today. The second scenario is the real-time monitoring for PMs and VOCs. This we consider as a team a medium amount of effort and cost effectiveness. And the third scenario is the real-time monitoring for PMs, VOCs, and radiation that we consider extensive efforts and more monitoring frequency of all VOCs. So now Ruben will tell you more deeply about these 3 scenarios.
Thank you, Santi. As Santi mentioned, I'm Ruben Go, and I'm also one of the members of the team that have worked on this risk assessment and monitoring plan. So just to give you a bit of background on what actually goes into the monitoring systems and services and some of the considerations we've made, this is particularly with regards to the selection of technologies that we would implement within our monitoring plans in order to record levels of COCs over time. Some of the qualifications and considerations are, of course, the financing mechanisms. So that will be things like CapEx, capital expenses, OpEx, operational expenses. So capital expenses would be things like the initial buy-in, how much the equipment will cost. Operational expenses would be how much it would cost to continue the upkeep of this equipment, any kind of maintenance costs that go on, or any kind of replacement parts. Present value, which speaks to the present value of the equipment as opposed to its depreciated value over time, and any other kind of technology and service-related costs. Of course, outside of its own financing mechanisms, we're also thinking of really just the qualitative aspects of the equipment. So equipment life expectancy is something that's important to us. Longer equipment also means we spend less money and it becomes more reliable. Things like maintenance, reducing any kind of additional labor, replacement parts, and the general needed upkeep was something that was really important to us. And finally, of course, UI, user interface, having something that is easily accessible, having data that is easily interpreted was of paramount importance to us, especially because this would require less training or less kind of replacement training as individuals move on between jobs. So ease of technology and service use was something that was very, very important to us as we constructed the report. So going a little bit into one of the first of the 3 scenarios that we propose, as Santi has mentioned earlier, this is business as usual, and important to stress is that this does not mean no action. It simply means there is no additional action on top of what is already being done. And so because of that, there is no additional cost. To be very clear, when we're looking at things like PM and VOCs, I understand from earlier in this meeting that things like radiation is very, very important to people in this meeting, and rightly so. We've included PM and VOCs as a long-term consequence and potential additional COC that could also affect individuals at BV. So under this scenario, there's no real-time monitoring of any particulate matter or volatile organic compounds. Radiation, there's no additional measurement of radiation at BV, and this would rely on existing Holtec systems, any kind of air samplers. As we understand it, there are 2 that are fairly close in proximity to BV as it stands. And for contaminants like asbestos, fiberglass, and lead that can be released during the deconstruction process of the site, there's no additional measurements, and any kind of regular visible asbestos checks that are being carried out would continue to be carried out every 6 months. Moving on, we have scenario 2, which would involve real-time monitoring for PM and VOCs. The additional cost for this incurred would be about $192,000. For PM and VOCs, this involves outdoor real-time air monitoring using the AQS-1 and the AQM-65 from a company called AeroQual. Over here on the left, you can actually see a diagrammatic representation of where we propose these monitors be placed. So in blue, you can see Indian Point. In green is actually BV, and slightly further away is Blue Mountain Middle School, which will serve as our control site given the topography and the distance. So placing one of each of the air monitors would allow us to form a correlation between any kind of contamination released from IP that reaches BV and having a control allows us to see what the ambient air quality would be like. So in addition to the AQS-1 and the AQM-65, which the AQM-65 is the more robust of the two units, the AQM-65 would be within BV, which is our primary site of concern. In addition to this, indoor real-time monitoring also happens, and that uses purple air sensors. You can see them on the left side dotted around the BV campus indoors that would allow us to account for both outdoor and indoor air quality. For radiation, under scenario 2, we propose that Holtec installs an additional air sampler at BV, and this would allow for a more accurate ascertainment of the air quality and any kind of radiation that might be a risk on site at the elementary school, as opposed to relying on air samplers that are close in proximity, and this prevents any kind of geographical variation from instilling any kind of doubt. We also propose that daily reports of the existing Voider-Stokes data that they have be a key change, a key step up in the frequency of radiation data available. This way we can know in more real time how that happens. That being said, of course, this is not exactly real time. It still requires daily data grabbing and processing of the data before any of that happens. For asbestos, fiberglass, and lead, there still remains no additional measurements, but more visible asbestos checks should be carried out, particularly on the condition that asbestos is found by Holtec at Indian Point, which has happened before. Finally, for scenario 3, for scenario 3, we have real-time monitoring of PM, VOCs, and radiation, and the additional cost of this is about $403,650. The main difference between scenario 2 and 3 is that the AQS-1 units, which are slightly less robust, get elevated to the AQM-65, which is AeroQual's most robust offering, and they replaced the AQS-1 sensors at IP and Blue Mountain Middle School. We also increased the indoor real-time monitoring with purple air sensors to include all the classrooms, so there's actual accuracy for each individual classroom rather than a generalized proxy for one classroom representing multiple. For radiation, on top of recommending that Holtec installs an air sampler at BV and a daily report of Voider-Stokes data, we also recommend that there could be the employment of real-time radiation monitoring using the EcoGamma-G radiation monitor, and this will allow us to know in real time what kind of radiation levels we are experiencing on site, and that can transfer into a policy framework, which I'll go into right after this. And of course, for asbestos, fiberglass, and lead, BV will hire professionals if lead, asbestos, or fiberglass is found at IP to carry out any kind of abatement processes that need to happen. A key qualification for this is that none of these scenarios include any kind of extreme, unforeseen, catastrophic events, such as explosions or any kind of sabotage that might happen. So that's a key qualification in the presupposition that all these scenarios consider, or do not consider, my bad. So breaking down our recommended scenarios, we have 5 criterions that we're basically evaluating our scenarios against. Over here, you can see on the leftmost column, you have risk to human health, short-term effectiveness, long-term effectiveness, implementability, and cost. So just kind of a clarification on what short-term effectiveness and long-term effectiveness constitutes. It speaks to the relative importance that we foresee of each individual COC along the decommissioning timeline. So for short-term effectiveness, we're looking at things like radiation. For long-term effectiveness, we're looking at things like VOCs from increased solvent use on site, or increased vehicular traffic from transporting material, and also things like PM from any kind of deconstruction activities that might go on site. So for scenario 1, we're seeing it fails on the parameters of risk to human health because there's no additional monitoring. Short-term effectiveness is accounted for because radiation is being monitored, but long-term effectiveness does not constitute any of the additional COCs that we are concerned about, so it fails on that grounds. Implementability is easy because there's no additional effort, and cost is also easy because there's no additional cost. Scenario 3 passes for risk to human health, short-term and long-term effectiveness, because it's the most robust and rigorous scenario we've proposed. The problem is that implementability is low, mainly because of the high costs associated with the project, and also because some of the data might be a bit more difficult to access, requiring more training for staff, especially when that handover process happens, it might be a bit more difficult. And therefore, we recommend scenario 2, which passes all of the 5 evaluation criteria we've put forth, which covering risk to human health, short-term effectiveness, long-term effectiveness, implementability, and cost. So moving on, right over here is a hazard response scale. Another qualification here is that this is mainly a framework, and the values represented on the slide here need to be agreed upon by the relevant stakeholders. So we've effectively separated our hazard response scale into 3 response brackets. Low response indicating an approximate lack of any health risk, medium response indicating still a lack of health risk, but any kind of contaminant levels being above the baseline, and high response constituting contaminant levels at a dangerous level, especially when it comes to things like long-term health consequences, which might not manifest in shorter timescales. So on the right here, I'm not going to read all of these values, but you can see that we've covered low, medium, and high for COCs like PM2.5, PM10, asbestos, fiberglass, VOCs, lead outdoors, lead indoors, and radiation, and the relevant citations we've pulled these values from. So talking a little bit about how that translates into policy, on the right here is basically what we've already seen, low, medium, and high response based on different brackets of measured contaminant values. On the left is the corresponding policy response. So in the low response bracket, what we're seeing is that there's no additional action necessary from stakeholders, and this is the obvious choice because there's no immediate health risk. For medium response, stakeholders, we believe that stakeholders should be notified of these results, and extra monitoring measures should be put in place, particularly making a distinction between whether elevated contaminant levels are any kind of snap trigger, any kind of major release event, or if it has been more of a slow increase over time, and that would constitute increased monitoring measures being put in place to understand where that change is coming from. And finally, high response would constitute urgent alerts be sent to stakeholders. BV should cease outdoor activities and exercise caution, and if any kind of levels continue to rise, some of the proposals we put forward would be a shift to either virtual learning or in the case of a town as small as the one we're dealing with, moving to an alternate in-person location could also be a viable option. And it's also recommended that we consider any kind of timing in the lagged response of human health to any kind of exposure. So that's important to also consider in a high response scenario, any kind of health hazards that can manifest down the road. Just finishing up, some of the potential benefits of the scenario 2, which we have presented, is that it basically puts forward real-time monitoring for additional COCs that may not be directly in the interest because radiation is such a large elephant in the room. We're including consideration for other contaminants that could have negative health impacts on the students and staff of BV. So real-time monitoring for PM and VOCs. Short-term effectiveness under scenario 2 is also good because it provides additional radiation monitoring. There's extra accuracy being granted when there's a new monitor being set up on BV's campus, and also increase in daily reports allows increased transparency on what's going on in the ambient environment. For long-term effectiveness, we're also considering under scenario 2 more contaminants for the entire decommissioning process, which could have health ramifications for the staff and students. It requires less training and administration logistics for BV. One of the major things I haven't covered due to time is that Aeroqual has a very robust API that allows you to access data, set alerts, and this would require a lot less training and administration when it comes to accessing data and looking at how levels have changed over time. In addition, it's cost effective. It's way less than half the cost of the proposed scenario 3, and because of that, it actually leaves a buffer in the outlined budget for any kind of cost overruns or as-needed services that may arise along the way. With that, I thank you very much for your time, and I guess this would be a time for any kind of comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe we're going to try to have a bit of Q&A. And first, we're going to start with Supervisor Becker.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, students, for your presentation tonight. I just want to give the audience a little background, but before I even get into this presentation, just the technical problems of tonight. It happens, you know, and this program was originally tried to be run out of Albany rather than on site here. But going forward for the meeting on the 27th as proposed, the town of Cortland can host it via Zoom from here directly so that we'd be able to meet that hybrid requirement, because I do think it's important. We've been doing that for every meeting here. We had one for Ahmad where we had 100 people online and it worked fine. And we have one coming up, for example, Monday night on Sustainable Westchester where people want to hear about that. So we can make, you know, you can have your presentation and we'll just take over that part of it to simplify it. Most importantly on this, what the students reported, I just wanted to give a little background how this happened. We all know that, and Mr. Hochreiter hears this more than I do, about the concerns about students being at BV in such close proximity to Indian Point. And of course it involves Buchanan, and Teresa's concerned, her community is right there. Montrose for Plank, it involves all of us. The state gave $500,000 to allow monitoring because they were aware of this concern. So the question comes up, who does the monitoring? How do you do it independently? What should be monitored? Where should the monitors be? Do you do it real time? How do you assess samples? And I happened upon, as luck would be, Jonathan Hollander, who's the professor at Columbia behind this project, and he happens to live here on Maple Avenue, and he has skin in the game because his kids will go to BV. So, and he happens to be teaching a course to graduate students who are looking for a capstone project. So everything came together terrifically, and they put together this very sophisticated study. We heard it last week here in Town Hall. The actual presentation is 100 pages in 3 hours, which we sat through. And it's a very detailed report. Teresa and the superintendent were there. And basically what this went through is what should be monitored, where the monitoring should be, what type of equipment should be used, and how that information should be reported and utilized in real time. So basically they're saying we should be looking at particulate matter, and we should be looking at VOCs as well as radiation, although the radiation concern is a little less because it will be monitored on site at Indian Point. But all three can be done. And they present cost-effective, real-time recommendations as to what equipment is out there, what could be used, how it should be done, and how it should be monitoring, and how that should give us all security, since children will be going to this school district. So that's the background. So I commend the students. I assume pretty soon you're all graduate and experts in the field now, and your report will be turned over to the superintendent and the school board for their use. So I think that was very helpful to the town, to the state, and to the community who wants to know that someone else out there is watching and protecting us. So I think this was a very fortuitous thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from the DOB? Yes, Richard?
Yeah, I have a quick one. So on the, so full disclosure, years ago I used to do this for construction sites. And what we used to do was try to build up a baseline for when the wind's blowing the opposite way, away from the construction site, and then use 95th percentile of the baseline for the intermediate level. So I wanted to know, have we considered that? And then in terms of when you exceed the intermediate level, the thing I'd normally want to check is what's the wind direction, and then if the wind direction is from the site, then communicate with the construction managers on the site to see whether what site activities could be causing the exceedance.
Right. Santiago?
I can take this one, and then Santi, you can add on if you so please. Yes, actually wind direction was one of our primary concerns, especially because a lot of the contaminants we deal with have the propensity to sorb to soil or any kind of wind, air-blown dust that might be churned up by any kind of wind. So we did actually construct a wind model that is in the full report that was just mentioned. AeroQual, the air sensors that we've actually included, also includes sensors for meteorological parameters, including things like wind direction, wind speed, relative humidity, and all that will go in to construct effectively a pattern that we can analyze to figure out where any kind of elevated levels of contaminants originates from, which is part of the reason why we've included a monitor also on site at IP, in addition to the ones we've proposed in BV and Blue Mountain Middle School. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I have a question on the costs. Were those costs presented for each scenario one-time costs, or are they annual costs?
Sorry, can you make the question again?
Yes. Are the costs that were presented for the scenarios one-time costs or annual costs?
Well, this is the cost we're presenting here is the total cost considering a 10 years monitoring scenario. So these costs consider the maintenance of the equipment, the replacement of the equipment, the operation of the equipment, and the cost of the equipment. And we in the official report, we're presenting the cost as total cost that we are presenting, and also we present the present value if it is useful for decision makers.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions from the DOB?
Can they stay on for my portion? I have questions.
I've got a request from the audience for you to stay on for the next presentation in case there are questions from the presenter. Is that all right? Santiago and Ruben?
They said they would stay on. Apologies.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, we want to thank the team at Columbia for an excellent presentation, an excellent work product. For your information, if you didn't hear it, there were applause from the audience. I think there's a lot of appreciation here for the work that you've done.
Tom, if I may echo
yes,
that.
Please.
As the school superintendent, I know we've been dealing with a lot of concern around the decommissioning and what that means for children being 4,000 feet away. And this is another step in the right direction of some of the pieces coming together. It began with Governor Hochul providing $500,000 to the school district for supplies, equipment, staffing, who knows. And this is going to be one piece and really, frankly, a recommendation for us to consider. Santiago said at the beginning of his comments that we don't have 3 hours to present. We were here a week ago, and we were here 3 hours, and we went through an 85-page report with a great level of specificity. So what the folks heard and saw over the last 15 and 20 minutes, we want to assure you that there was great depth and breadth into their report. And I'd like to thank the supervisor for connecting us with Columbia. And I also want to thank who's on the call, David Lockbaum, who's been a fantastic ad hoc advisor to the school district and the school board, and hopefully will continue in that capacity, because where we need to go now is a conversation of so what. We purchase monitoring equipment, we have our standards, we have communication vehicle, we have a way of notification, and then what? You know, who does what, where, how, and when, so situations can be remedied, so students can move to a safer location. But the next step here is going to be really a question of who will be able to knock on the door at Holtec, for example, and try to remedy a situation which the school district's responding to, and I hate to say it, but that's not our core competency either. So, we're relying on a lot of support from the state and from technical experts to make sure that we're responding the right way. But, our core competency is teaching children, so we're going to need a lot of help along the way. And again, this is a great first step in starting to bridge that gap. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. So I want to move along to the next part of our agenda. The Indian Point host community is really blessed to have numerous individuals who are well-versed in nuclear power issues and pipeline safety issues, and it's a well-organized community. And the community brings attention to serious issues that have been of great value to the DOB. Courtney Williams is one of those individuals. She's passionate, very active member in her community, and we have a great deal of respect for Courtney and welcome her tonight to present, and look forward to a constructive exchange of information. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I'm just going to start with the few questions I had for the students, so they don't need to stay on after. And some of my relevant qualifications are on this slide. So I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Molecular Biochemistry and Biophysics from Yale, a PhD in Molecular Biology from Princeton, and I did my postdoctoral training at MIT in Biological Engineering, and have spent the last nearly decade using that training and to bring to bear on public health and public safety with regards to the co-location of the gas transmission pipeline system at Indian Point. So my questions for the students is, when you did your scale in terms of health impacts, like health risks, were those legal limits? I saw you cited the EPA for some of them. Are those legal limits, or did you look in the literature for limits that actually harm public health?
Between legal limits and what could actually affect health. For PM asbestos and for PM VOCs and lead, we use the EPA, the legal limits, and for lead, we use a paper actually about the real health risk to the community. And for asbestos and fiberglass, we use what is the current regulation for workers.
Thank you. So I would just like to make this board aware that the literature is really clear that a legal limit does not constitute a safe or healthy limit in terms of air pollution. Just this morning, I was on a webinar with Richard Fuller, who's the lead author in the Lancet's Commission on Pollution and Public Health, and they did an update that made it really clear that our legally allowable limits for ambient air pollution are still harming our health. So I would, I doubt we'll get Holtec to agree to do anything above the absolute bare minimum required by law, but I think it would be great if we could use limits that actually impact public health versus what is the legally allowable limit. I also, my next question for the students, did you look at the surrounding area in terms of VOCs and things? Because this really is an environmental justice area. So we have 3 of the largest sources of air emissions in Westchester County, located within a few miles of the school. So very close to BV is the gypsum plant, also the BASF chemical plant, and then the largest source of air pollution in Westchester County that includes things like mercury, cadmium, lead, formaldehyde, etc., is the Wheelabrator trash incinerator that burns the entirety of Westchester County's waste. So I'm wondering, I would not be surprised at all if you turned on your detectors and found that the students at BV are already being exposed to VOCs and other things that are much above safe limits. So I'm wondering, with your modeling, did you account for those large sources of air pollution right near the school?
Okay, I guess I'll take this one. This specifically was not within our scope of the investigation. We hadn't had access to do any kind of ambient monitoring to establish current baselines. We do expect for a lot of the VOCs and things like PM, because we expect that to be a concern that would be more pertinent later down the timeline of the decommissioning process, that any kind of setting up of a monitoring equipment would hopefully kind of capture that before the majority of the that kind of activity takes place. But strictly speaking, that's right now any kind of my suppositions and assumptions. Within our report, that is not within our scope, to be completely clear about it. So just to make a distinction, no, not within our report, but my own personal suppositions is that there might be more information as soon as we set up any kind of monitors to see if there's any change over time. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's the last of my questions for them. Thanks so much for staying on.
I want to
Thank you,
comment
Chief.
that we are recommending, especially for PM, measuring in 3 locations. So that way we can know if the PM is coming actually from Holtec or from another place in the surroundings of the school.
Great.
Okay. Back to our normal
Yep.
presentation? Okay.
So, let's see, I'm also watching the WebEx has dropped again, so people on WebEx are seeing this, the webinar will continue soon. So I'm watching it on my tablet,
You
so
wanna
I
pause a
can
moment?
see. Yeah, I can wait.
Okay.
Of me? Okay. Then you don't want to ask me.
Do they have radiological detectors on site now? And if they do, are they monitored for outside communities? In other words, do they go to closest county, do they go?
They do.
So there's already.
Yep.
Why are we doing this now? Should this be done like?
I would agree that it should have been before now. No, good questions. And we've got time.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I was doing the technical difficulties.
Yeah, the
What
question was
the
just if we currently have radiation monitoring,
Yes.
and if it is reported to like Westchester County or the state. And so I
Yes.
said, yes, we do currently have
Yes.
monitoring and it's reported.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, there was a slide in the earlier part of the presentation that showed the real-time results from yesterday. Is it back up, Courtney? No?
Nope.
Really appreciate the supervisor's offer to take over the technical.
Yeah, yeah. And is the report that the students did, is that going to be publicly available?
All the slides will certainly be publicly available.
I mean, the
They're still
80-page,
working- the 80-page
3-hour version?
portion, I think they're still finalizing,
Okay.
but yes, we'll.
They were sent back with revisions.
Okay.
Courtney, I'm getting text that WebEx is the problem.
Okay.
And so we may want to proceed in
Okay.
the interest of time.
All right.
Um,
So if we can back up one slide. So that was my intro slide. And the kids that you saw in the picture with me, those are my kids, both, one currently still at BV, the other graduated from BV. And I've been doing this work regarding the co-location of the pipelines at Indian Point since 2013. So have a lot of, oh, it's back up, great. All right, so if we could go back one slide, but if that's gonna mess stuff up, we don't need to. Okay, great. So yes, I live in Peekskill. I'm a parent of 2 Henhud students, member of the City of Peekskill Conservation Advisory Council, co-founded Safe Energy Rights Group specifically to address the safety issues of Indian Point and the pipelines. Recently founded Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions to address the air pollution from the Wheeler Breeder trash incinerator. Have participated in the consultation on climate and use during the Universal Periodic Review for the United Nations. And let's see, relevant stuff. Yeah, and the rest we can move on to. I'm currently employed as a cancer researcher, but here today as a parent and advocate. Next slide. So this one just shows the locations of the pipelines. So in yellow is the new 42-inch pipeline. In red, you will see 2 pipelines, one kind of going very close to the reactors. That's the old pipeline. The Algonquin pipeline is a system, not a single gas pipeline. Next slide, please. And I do have a lot of slides, and I apologize if this is going to be very fast. So this is a graph showing the average number of annual pipeline incidents per 10,000 miles of gas transmission pipe. And you can see that that rate is very high for pipes built in the 2010s, like the Algonquin pipeline expansion. And per PHMSA, that's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, there were never and has never been a federally compliant safety assessment for the old pipelines that predate the nuclear power plant or the newest pipeline. So question for DPS, do you acknowledge And I'm asking DPS because for folks listening, PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, delegates some authority to DPS for oversight of pipeline safety. So do we acknowledge the failure and call upon PHMSA to produce a federally compliant risk analysis and integrity management plan as required by federal law?
So we have gas safety team on the phone, and I'm going to just take the questions and answers. No, we have technical staff that would probably add a lot more detail than I.
Okay.
But in the interest of time and technology,
Yeah.
I will tell you this issue has been raised over the years. Former Congresswoman Nita Lowey wrote to us specifically citing these very regulations. We wrote back to her after having consulted with PHMSA to request that they confirm compliance. They did confirm compliance with these regulations that are specified.
And did they
here.
produce a risk assessment?
The company has produced the risk assessment and integrity management plan to PHMSA as they are required to do. And PHMSA confirmed that. PHMSA is also currently conducting, because this is an ongoing review that's regularly updated, and PHMSA is currently conducting an audit of the current integrity management plan, and the DPS gas safety team is a party to that.
Okay. Next slide, please. So another thing to keep in mind is that emergency planning for Indian Point does not account for co-location of the pipelines at Indian Point. The evacuation plan, unrealistic. At my house, the picture on the top is what I get in the mail every single year. It is a pamphlet about emergency planning for Indian Point and a pamphlet about emergency planning for the pipeline. Those two things do not agree with each other. I should neither shelter in place nor leave my house. I should neither pick up the phone and call an emergency line or not call an emergency line. If there is no agreement between these two documents for this community that lives at the intersection of the pipeline and the nuclear plant. Holtec recently put out a survey that was designed, I think, to exclude people who need help in an evacuation, supposedly to look at what would be needed for that. It used a QR code for access to the survey because we know people who maybe don't have a car or whatever, they're totally tech savvy enough to use a QR code. It required a computer to take, it was only online, and it was only in English, as though nobody speaking Spanish lives in the 10-mile evacuation zone of Indian Point. And I raised this in an email to some of our county folks. Also, the emergency planning at the 4-county level has never done a scenario involving the pipelines in Indian Point. They do these trainings with FEMA and all of the Office of Emergency Management. They have never done one that includes the gas pipelines. So there's, and this pipe crosses under Route 9, 684, 84, the Taconic. So if we're going to talk about a problem at Indian Point evacuating, and we've never considered the pipelines that bisect a large portion of this 10-mile evacuation zone, include the Palisades on the Rockland side, it seems like they should be considering it. So I have a bunch of questions at the bottom. I also have a lot of slides. So I don't know if we want to answer all of these. I think that the big ask would be for this DOB to urge the county and the 4-county coordinator and the federal folks that are involved in those trainings to do a scenario involving the pipeline. And also to address the fact, I know that Enbridge and Holtec check their boxes that they do the necessary trainings of first responders, but I don't know that anyone ever asks the first responders if they've had these trainings. I have asked them, and it's like a binder gets dropped off with a thing of donuts and a jug of coffee. It is not adequate training. So I would ask that before allowing them to tick the box that they've trained our local first responders, that you actually talk to our first responders and find out what those trainings look like. Next slide, please. So we know that Enbridge is currently doing additional work to hook up their auxiliary pipeline under the Hudson River to the 26-inch pipeline. On the right is a picture of an Enbridge pipeline, auxiliary pipeline, under the Arkansas River blowing up. And Enbridge didn't even know this had happened until an angry tugboat captain called the Coast Guard because his tugboat was damaged, and the Coast Guard seemed to remember there was a pipeline under there, and they called Enbridge and told Enbridge that their pipeline had blown up, and it took 48 hours to let the city of Little Rock know that there'd been a pipeline rupture. On the left is the same pipeline owned by Enbridge, blowing up in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, but still managing to nearly kill someone. And on the bottom, I've overlaid that blast radius with the area between my kids' school and Indian Point. And what you can see is that it would level, it would include the school, the ball field, the backup generators, and the substation that provides power not only to Indian Point, but a large chunk of the Northeast, and was responsible for the blackout that happened in the 1970s. So I think that we really need to take into account the risks that are posed by this pipeline, and I don't think Holtec appreciates them at all. And I'm wondering why Enbridge has never been here to answer for their own safety. Because as much as we yell at Holtec, they're here talking to us. Next slide, please. So the first of 4 risk assessments that have resulted in 0 action was 2015, commissioned by the town of Cortland. We had Rick Kuprowitz from AccuFacts here to talk with us about, and he's the one who was responsible for this, along with Paul Blanche, because they had the necessary security clearance. So questions: has DPS reviewed this assessment? Does DPS agree with the conclusions that the safety evaluation and analysis is seriously deficient and inadequate, and what's being done to rectify this? And if you don't agree with the analysis, why not?
So this was a dated analysis, and as you know, we've been around a few times on various risk assessments.
Yep.
And so part of the state's risk assessment did evaluate this one at that time.
Okay, cool. Then we can go to the next slide, because that's the state's risk assessment. Oh, sorry, this is Entergy's risk assessment. Just so everybody can see the picture that was actually submitted by Entergy as part of their safety assessment and accepted by both FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You probably can't read it, but somehow FERC and the NRC did. And that also included the nebulous 3-minute shutdown, where Enbridge said they could shut down the gas in 3 minutes, which we now know to be completely untrue, and which this community and some of the elected officials at this table and activists in this room called out at the time, but the pipeline was approved. Next slide, please. We can skip this, I guess. This is just to put on the record. We had Rick Kuprowitz here last time, kind of singing a different tune from what he said, what he told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on numerous occasions about what does he say with his own words? Security claims should not be permitted to shelter malfeasance in a scientific method involving incomplete risk analysis for such a highly sensitive structure. Next slide, please. So here's from New York State's risk assessment. So the state found areas that require further review. So have they been reviewed? What was the outcome? Given that this approval of the pipeline was based on the 3-minute shutdown, DPS has shown that's not true. What action was taken? What new information does New York State have that they're no longer calling for ceasing gas flow? So in that circled part, given the heavy excavator work that will be part of decommissioning, FERC may need to require Enbridge to temporarily cease gas operations during the decommissioning activities that may threaten pipeline integrity. FERC has no purview there, right? That's PHMSA and DPS. And so does DPS acknowledge FERC has no jurisdiction there and that it's DPS and PHMSA? But really, this was a pretty scathing risk assessment number 3 or so that came out. And why are we no longer concerned?
So we stand by the risk assessment and the statements made in it. And if you read the circled language, the state essentially says, based on the activities during decommissioning, one of the measures that should be considered would be depressurizing the line, would be temporary, would be based on actual information about the activity. So when we did the risk assessment, it was in part to inform state regulatory actions. And so we had the information, we questioned the 3-minute, as you know. From that, the action that we took was to request from PHMSA permission to do an audit, both a field audit and a control room audit that our staff traveled to Houston to do. You referenced that we found that the 3 minutes was overly optimistic and that we calculated.
It was a lie, basically, and was known to be impossible before a shovel went into the ground, per Rick Hooperwitz, who joined us last meeting.
Right. So we expressed concern with that, and our action was to go out and do the audit to confirm what a more realistic number would be. We published that. We explained that to PHMSA and to FERC and others. What we also did, when we noted this about the potential mitigation measures could include depressurizing the line, we stand by that, and that's still a possibility. When we developed the joint protocol, the joint proposal that identified co-location of the pipelines as a critical thing that Holtec needed to plan for and coordinate with the pipeline operator, Enbridge, the whole idea there is to go action by action as they undergo decommissioning and assess that action for potential impacts to the pipeline. And the whole point of it is to ensure that the engineers that are responsible for integrity management on the pipeline understand the activity that is happening with Holtec, take that into consideration for the pipeline and approve it, or raise concerns that would require other mitigation or alternatives. And so it may be that a temporary depressurizing of the line still may be something that would be warranted based on the communications that are going to be ongoing throughout decommissioning.
And I guess my concern is, like, we're talking about Enbridge, who lied about being able to shut off the pipeline in 3 minutes when we told everybody in 2015 that it was likely more like 30 minutes to an hour. So Enbridge, who lied, and Holtec, who's now the, I guess, the offspring of Entergy that submitted that handwritten thing, that handwritten map of the pipeline. So this is, like, I think the concern of this community is that over and over again, so right, we're on risk assessment number whatever, and every risk assessment, no matter how bad it is or what it says, results in no corrective action. So basically, Enbridge could lie about this 3-minute shutdown, get this massive gas pipeline built under the nuke plant and next to my kid's school, then be found out to have falsified that, and no consequence.
Well, I mean, I guess I would just disagree respectfully with the characterization that there's been no corrective actions. What we did with the risk assessment was evaluate what regulatory actions the state should take. That informed our requirement in the joint proposal that there be these communications that we have to also get, that we coordinate. We're a part of that. It's not just the two companies talking to one another. The DPS actually facilitates and hosts quarterly meetings of the two companies. We have our gas safety team in those meetings to discuss and hear the coordination that's happening. So I don't want to just...
But they don't meet that 3 minutes. And there has not been, like, you're just okay that that was not true, and that all these safety assessments were based on that.
No, we're not okay with that, and that's why we did the audit, to highlight why that was inaccurate. And I think in our discussions with Rick Kuprowitz, part of his beef with those previous characterizations were that the risks were being diminished by those statements being out there. From his point of view, and that is shared by our gas safety staff, you have to understand an accurate portrayal of the risks in order to know what are the appropriate mitigation measures to take. And that was the fundamental problem with those earlier risk assessments. But you get to a point about whether there's a violation of anything as it pertains to the 3 minutes. At the time of their characterization of the 3 minutes, my understanding, and I'm sorry about the technical issues, but my technical staff could speak to this better than I. But the regs were not in place by PHMSA to require a minimum time frame by which remote valves should shut off a line in the event of an incident. There were no regs until very recently, I think 2022 actually, and now that reg is 30 minutes. So based on our audit of what they can accomplish, they would be within the regulatory limit that's now in effect.
And oh, sorry, Sandy, go ahead.
We get an update from PHMSA then if they're doing an additional.
Yeah, I have a slide on that in a little bit.
Yeah, and maybe they should participate here so we find out.
I think when
again
that
what
study
they're
comes
doing.
out, the Oak Ridge study, we would want to invite them to present. So I agree.
So the 30 minutes, when you did the control room audit, you were in the room and you said, close the valve, right? And that took some certain period of time.
So the way it works is, yes, it's from the time of the incident. So at the time of the incident, then there's an accounting of the time it takes from the incident to communicate that to the control room. Then from the control room, there's time that they observed, the staff observed, from getting that information conveyed to them and taking the action and then hitting the button or whatever to close the remote valve, and then witnessing to see the valve close in the field.
And so in your scenario, they were notified that there was a problem, or they detected a problem?
I'm really sorry about that. I don't want to go where my technical staff should answer.
It's the questions kind of on here, but the reason for the public that I'm asking is that there's a difference between being told, like, I've got eyes on this pipeline, it has ruptured, turn off the gas, and what kind of data the control room has to know there's been a rupture, and that often takes 30 minutes to an hour if they don't have eyes.
I understand your question now. So they monitor pressure on the line, and so if there's a dramatic drop in pressure that would occur from a rupture, our staff confirmed in the control room they have access to the data to show that that drop in pressure would be seen by the operators that are in the control room.
What role did it matter that you have a massive compressor station just right across the river, just a few miles from Indian Point? Does the fact that it is all pressurized, like 3 miles from the plant, have an influence on the ability of them to detect a drop in pressure?
Yeah. It is my understanding that a rupture would show up in the control room immediately as a drop in pressure. So, but to your point, and it's a good one, there's still humans involved, and the humans in the control room have to interpret the data, and they have to understand what that drop means, what could have caused it, and so that can result in a delay in terms of the action taken to close the valve.
So I would ask that in the answer to that question, that your staff review Rick Kuprowitz's documentation, where he seemed to think that would play a role, and that it would be between 30 minutes and 1 hour, in which case maybe they would not be able to meet that PHMSA requirement. Next slide, please. So this is just to put into the record a statement from Dr. Erwin Redliner, who's the former director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, also at Columbia University, where he made clear the risks that are posed here. So shutting down this gas flow should happen immediately in order to avert the possibility of a catastrophic explosion that would have widespread deadly consequences to our region. And he said that before we were talking about demolishing a nuclear plant on top of it. Next slide, please. So then we had this really profound Office of the Inspector General report, investigation and report from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so that the public knows and everyone on this board knows, the NRC analysis appeared to be backwards engineering to get a desired result. So they just kept fudging around with numbers until they were able to get an okay that this was safe. And, you know, the last slide in this deck, which we probably won't get to, is a timeline back to 2013 where we showed all of this. Long before there was a shovel in the ground, we knew all of this had happened. Next slide. And so, like, really nothing was done after this investigation either. And we brought up the PSDAR earlier, and I thought it was really important for everyone to understand that when they released their response to the public comments, that they said public comments or questions that upon review were found to be outside of the NRC's regulatory purview or outside the scope of the NRC staff's review of a post-shutdown decommissioning activities report are summarized below. So questions or comments about NRC oversight while the plant is decommissioning has nothing to do with the decommissioning activities report. Questions or comments about the pipeline system near Indian Point during decommissioning activities, also not under the purview of a decommissioning activities report. Questions or comments about whether the current dry cask storage canisters can be monitored, inspected, or repaired. The decommissioning activity is putting the fuel in those canisters, not relevant. Questions or comments about the transportation of nuclear waste on which this entire decommissioning plan hinges, also not relevant. So the question that is kind of just a rhetorical one, that does DPS and this DOB and participating agencies acknowledge that the NRC is not adequately overseeing decommissioning? And how is the DOB ensuring that critical safety issues don't fall through the cracks because no agency will accept or coordinate responsibility for this oversight? Because we've got this alphabet soup: FERC, PHMSA, NRC, DPS, you know, TSA, all of these agencies, and every single one wants to point to somebody else and say it's somebody else's problem, and the coordination is missing.
It's a fair point. I think that DPS has a unique role in that we touch a little bit of all of it, and that's why we were the agency that formed the Decommissioning Oversight Board. I think that we understand at the state level the expectations in the community for oversight, and we take it seriously. I think the state has expressed to NRC a desire to see their resident inspector stay, for example.
I mean, I'm fine with it not being theirs, because their residence inspectors are what got us, their lack of oversight is what's got us here. So I'm A-okay with them stepping away and DPS stepping in.
I appreciate the concerns, and I think, though, that there are some really excellent professionals within the NRC. We want them to be on site. We want them to be doing inspections. They do find violations. They have issued citations. We want them here. We want to work with them, but we also recognize the high standards that this community has for state safety. We share those high standards, and we're stepping in where we think it's appropriate.
Great. Okay, so my next slide, yet another risk assessment, because we're just going to talk about trying multiple shots on the goal to find one that says everything is safe. This was in the NRC's OIG report. They contracted with Sandia National Labs to do another risk assessment of what might happen if the pipeline at Indian Point sprung a leak. And what they found was that within 8 minutes of a leak in that pipeline, the flammability region of that gas would encompass and surround the SOCA, which is the
Secure,
secure-
owner-controlled area.
Yes. And so the NRC put this in their investigation, in the results of their investigation, and then said that they concluded that the pipelines pose no risk. So, does the DOB acknowledge the results here, that a vapor cloud could encompass the entirety of the security owner-controlled area within 8 minutes? And can you explain to this community now, that the ignition of this vapor cloud would have no impact on the operation at Indian Point? And if so, what's the evidence for that? Because I would think at least the employees out there working would most definitely be caught in that conflagration.
So I have 2 points on this. One, I go back to Rick Cooperwitz's comments at the last meeting, where he said there could be catastrophic consequences associated with the rupture. And he said that's why it's so critically important that you just don't allow a rupture. Respect the pipeline, don't fear the pipeline, were I think his exact words. And by putting in the right protocols, you can avoid an incident. That being said, on the Sandia study here, you mentioned before the OIG report and nothing happened. Well, something did happen. The NRC was required to do a reassessment. They assembled an expert team to do that assessment, and that report came out. This document was attached to that report, and I'll just quote from it. Given the accident experience from PHMSA, input from the independent pipeline expert, local terrain effects, and the presence of ignition sources, the team concludes that that there is reasonable assurance that the safety-related equipment at any point would enable the reactors to be shut down and remain safely shut down, providing for adequate protection of public health and safety. So this was
Right, but we're not dealing with shutdown anymore.
Right. Well, correct. I mean,
We're beyond that.
Yeah. So it's in
We're beyond shutdown of the
We're in
reactor.
a safer position now than we were when it was an operating reactor.
And do we know that the dry casks can withstand being caught within a pipeline fire? And for the public to know, usually when these things blow up, you have to evacuate for several miles around because, it'll set your house on fire and melt your siding. So are those casks able to withstand that kind of a fire?
So I believe that NRC reassessment evaluated the distance of the casks to the pipelines and considered what the impacts of a fire to be and concluded that, yes, that would be a safe distance and a safe technology to withstand any impacts associated with it.
So I think what this community feels is or thinks is happening here, sees happening here, is like what happened with the Tappan Zee Bridge. So there used to be federal requirements for safety that said, the structural integrity of the bridge has to be above 75% or it has to be closed. And then the Tappan Zee was below that, and so they said, all right, we'll drop it. Now it's 70%, and now it's 66%. And so this is yet another risk assessment. There's another one coming. Why have there been this many? Now there's going to be one from Oak Ridge National Labs. Why are we doing that one now? And why do we keep doing these? And why should every time it comes out with results like this, but we're told it's fine. It actually is okay. It doesn't affect anything.
I think the answer to the question is because I believe that there's a perception that the community wants further risk assessments to be done.
Really what we want is action on the risk assessments that have been done.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to 2015.
Right, and I think I've discussed earlier what the state did with its own risk assessment. There were actionable items in it for the state to take. We took those actions. We are eager to see the results of Oak Ridge's study. And if there are further actionable items from that, we're prepared to take them.
Could I get the next slide? So So this is modeling done by the Princeton University Program for Science and Global Security. And the finding of their study was that the NRC underestimates the potential for a nuclear disaster. And so we reached out to them and asked them if they could model what would happen to the spent fuel at Indian Point if there was a spent fuel fire. And this was the map based on 2015 modeling data. And I've put the citations in there for both the peer-reviewed article and a lay article for folks who want to read it, just to remind us of what is at risk here.
And can I ask a question about that? So when did the folks at Princeton conduct this analysis?
So the paper was published in 2017.
Right. I'm familiar with the paper.
Yes, and so we reached out to them, I'm not sure what the date is, shortly after that, and asked them to model. And so they used the same weather data that they had from 2015 to model it on Indian Point.
And so I understand that. I'm familiar with this study, and there are some related studies with it as well. I just want to put it in perspective, if I could, in a historical, chronological perspective, which is 2015, 2017, whatever the date was, that was while the 2 units were generating power. It's a different situation now. There are not operating reactors. There is fuel, spent nuclear radioactive fuel, in 2 spent fuel pools. That fuel is going to be removed from the pool to a different type of storage configuration. And I would suggest that one way of looking at what has occurred following the 2018 DPS or risk assessment and all the action that the state has taken in the last several years is that the risk profile has decreased since the closure of the reactor, and that there is less risk now. So I just, you are free to disagree with me.
Well, I'm just going to clarify. I wouldn't disagree with you, but I would like to clarify, this was not modeling a reactor meltdown. This was just spent fuel, of which we still have some in the pools, and which we still have gas flowing beneath.
And in response to that, I would say, yes, it did look at spent fuel pools, but the current situation as of May 2022 is a situation that has less risk than when these learned experts did the modeling. And I'm not criticizing them at all. As I said, I'm familiar with the study, but right now there is less risk, just given
less risk or less consequence.
There is. Well, I'm not going to get in a word.
Well, just
debate
because for the public, risk
someone,
assessment is the odds of it happening and the consequence of what would happen if it did.
The risk profile of a fast-moving accident is less likely now than it was when this study was first published.
And I would love to see the data, and I'll go back to the NRC OIG report that said those spent fuel casks, the dry storage casks, can withstand a fire. And also because we saw the images, there's no berm or anything there's some elevation, but to block this conflagration from including the asphyxie pad. Next slide, please. So we had a hearing with our, that was put together by our federal electeds, because we harass them just like we do our local and state electeds. And so they came to Cortland, and we went through a lot of this same information. And I think it was somewhat embarrassing for them to claim they hadn't seen this, we didn't know about that, and we just produced document after document after document that they were CC'd on. And we laid all of this out, and they didn't do anything about it. Or they said they're doing this. Oak Ridge National Labs is doing yet another risk assessment. And again, they said that this 3-minute shutdown doesn't amount to non-compliance, which I think the public, there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and I think it's really obvious to anybody who looks at this situation that the spirit of the law was most definitely violated, and they got away with it, and so now there's no consequence. So questions for the DOB, again, this issue of the 3 minutes, but what is the status of this study? And why, if this study is necessary, is decommissioning allowed to proceed and gas flow in light of the regulatory failures and the need for this additional risk assessment? And then also poking around online for what I would have to do if I was digging in my yard. There's all kinds of online tools for know before you dig and checking off your progress reports and everything. Is Holtec doing those same things?
Well, the Know Before You Dig, very critical program, by the way, is meant to ensure that anyone doing the work or digging has the critical infrastructure mapped out for them, marked out. The Holtec knows very well where the pipelines are, and the coordination and communication that we have facilitated and required essentially is just like that, that is required as Know Before You Dig. The other questions we discussed earlier, the regulatory.
Do you know when that study is due?
We don't. We're not doing it. We're not controlling it. So I don't think any of us on the DOB, anyone else.
Okay. We'll follow
aware,
up with our federal
right.
electeds. All right, next slide. I do think we're nearing the end.
But Courtney, if I
yeah.
could just, with respect to why is gas allowed to flow, I thought Rick Kuprowitz's presentation last meeting was instructive. He said that it's potentially a false sense of security to shut gas off on the line for various activities. Our team thinks that it still may be warranted given the activity, and we're not aware of any activity that would warrant it. But as we learn more and we get into it, we're open to that. His point being that you have to take all the protocols to protect the pipe, whether there's gas in it or not, because if you turn the gas back on, having not taken the protocols, then there could be damage to the pipe, right? And so...
but I think that gets at Mr. Sipos' point, which is that once all that fuel is in the spent fuel, in the dry storage casks, and everything's done, presumably our risk profile will be much lower when you re-turn on the gas, right?
Courtney, can I ask you a question here? Because the way I see it is that the things that are being done in decommissioning, right? They defueled the reactor. That was a good thing. I think actually NGT did that. They're going to be taking the fuel to dry storage, which will get it out of the spent fuel pool. So to me, all of those things are lowering the risk profile. So,
they are.
So aren't those things that we want to happen when the gas is on or off?
Yes. I'm not saying leave anything in the spent fuel pools.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. Sorry if I gave that impression. Absolutely not. I'm basically saying, why is the gas flowing and decommissioning proceeding we're not on top of these gas transmission pipelines? More to the point of turn off the gas when we have gas pipelines crisscrossing the property.
And I don't want to argue with you, but I asked early on about this, and we tried to put in weight limits, and we tried to put in reinforcement of the crossings and so forth. So the decommissioning isn't proceeding as though there is no gas in the pipeline.
Yeah. So I just want to be clear. I toured Indian Point in December. There were no plates anywhere. I was really surprised when you told me that there's a binder in the control room with the Enbridge control room phone number on it, because nobody giving me a tour, including Mr. Baroni, knew anything about it. I asked, do you know who your counterparts are at Enbridge? Do you know how to reach them? Answer was no. And presumably the binder had been in the control room for years at that point. Nobody knew a thing about it. There were no plates over anything. They still think that, and actually if we can get the next slide, it might be on there. They still think if the pipeline blows up, they're going to go outside with fire hoses. That was in the answers to the Q&A that were posted on the docket. You don't fight a pipeline fire with a fire hose. Like, people outside, if that blows up at Indian Point, are going to be dead. They're not going to be outside with fire hoses.
No, I think the fire brigade, I think, is what you're referring to. The fire brigade protects systems inside. They would not, you're right, I mean, they're not taking the fire hoses out to combat the pipe.
Can I get the next slide?
Yeah.
Maybe to Courtney that, maybe you want to go back again, because it was different when I went, when did I go? February? I can't remember. So it may be, you know, your influence may have been very, very helpful in a lot of the things that were happening or not happening. So you might want to do a secondary tour with.
Well, no, I agree. I do think it had something to do with that. But that's why I feel like it's a little bit of almost gaslighting, like I'm unreasonable for saying this, even though I toured the site and this was the status of things. So, you know, and I'm not getting the next slide, whoever is running the WebEx. But like in the Q&A.
I'm not saying you're unreasonable.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think we're having I hope we're having an honest debate about what's the best approach.
I didn't even know we were debating.
Well, I think we are. I think I've heard debate. I don't know.
Okay.
You can call it what you want.
Like in the Q&A answers, there was a response in the answers saying that they can keep their, that their fire brigade can keep their systems operational.
That's different than saying that they are using their fire hoses to fight a pipeline fire.
I have the exact quote in the slide, if we could get it.
Slide.
I didn't print out my own slides. There might be on the next one that, Tom, like your next one. I don't think it's that one. I think it's the next one. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. There, I copy pasted into the bullet points there.
Oh, okay, I'll read it to you.
Yeah.
Holtec maintains that we have the capability to use fire hoses to help local fire departments combat a pipeline fire as stated, along with the local fire departments. The Enbridge contact information readily available in each control room. Q&A from March DOB. Okay.
Okay,
All right.
so they're saying they're going to go out there with fire hoses.
The primary purpose of the fire brigade is to control any damage within their
Right.
systems.
Mhm.
To the extent that there is value in also going out at other locations, then their fire brigade would be
Mhm.
helping the local first responders.
Right, but
it's not-
but you understand my point is
I do
that they think that that is an effective way of combating a pipeline fire, shows they don't know what goes on if a pipeline ruptures. Right, because spraying water, no one's going to be outside alive if that pipeline blows up near Indian Point. So that, I guess, there was a key point slide, and then that slide you're looking at has a bunch of other community concerns on it, which I don't have a slide to look at, so.
I'm sorry, I'm being told it's completely frozen.
You got it? Thanks, Richard. And sorry to the public, I'm
Your
sure these
slides
will
will
be
be public.
uploaded to the docket.
They
Okay.
definitely will.
So other topic, I heard from people, there are several topics that they would like a future DOB presentation on. So dumping of the spent fuel pool water into the Hudson. And I think this is an example of like when I gave my public comment of where it would be helpful to have a best practices standard versus what Holtec wants to do, right? Because it is possible that they could store that water for enough half-lives that when they put it into the Hudson, it was no longer tritiated and no longer radioactive. But that might take 12 years, and they want to be done in 12 years. So what they want to do based on the cost is not necessarily what would be a best practice in terms of public health, public safety, and environmental safety. I also heard from folks that they want a presentation of hardened on-site storage of waste and how that compares to what Holtec's proposing. A presentation by the TSA on cybersecurity, given the pipeline hacking that has happened in the past. A compare and contrast of our multiple different risk assessments from AccuFacts, New York State, Sandia Labs, and now Oak Ridge Labs. Like, why are we doing all of them, and how does it compare? Holtec, they come before the firing squad almost every meeting. Why isn't Enbridge ever here? So can we have Enbridge presentations on safety measures, that whole concrete bridge underground thing that Mr. Baroni mentioned? Rick Cooperwitz is on the record as saying putting a concrete slab can just make a concrete projectile if there's a pipeline rupture. So we should know what they're proposing. And I'm also concerned with the increased capacity on the 24-inch auxiliary pipeline that they're working on right now. Are they planning to put that back into service? And are we going to have an angry tugboat captain or perhaps an angry riverkeeper patrol boat captain with a damaged boat? Also, the notification of venting. I didn't get notification until after it was done, and I happened to see it posted on, I forget if it was the Village of Buchanan's Facebook or Town of Cortland Facebook. Lots of questions about school safety. I really liked the presentation today, and it sounds like we can get adequate funding if their Cadillac plan was still under the $500,000 we got from the state, although I would argue that my kids and the other 300 kids and staff at that school are worth way more than $500,000, and we should throw the money at it that it takes to keep those students and staff safe. I also think in the school safety thing, there was a lot of confusion at the last meeting about the timeline of demolition, where the presentation and discussion was saying it was a decade away, which was clearly not true, and I don't know how that happened. And then the next section, I guess I'll skip over because we kind of talked about it, but Holtec employee awareness of the pipeline, because in December, nobody knew nothing. We definitely need more than just the control room people who won't hear, see, or realize there's a pipeline rupture. We need all the employees on the site aware of what to listen for so they can call the control room before there's a fire. There's also a large lack of trust in Holtec, which I think you heard tonight from this community. A lot of concern about small modular reactors and putting those at Indian Point like they are doing at Oyster Creek. The safety record at Oyster Creek, the treatment of union workers at Oyster Creek. There was a recent Washington Post expose, which was mentioned earlier. I encourage everybody to read it. We do not want that happening here. And then in terms of the public input, I'm really excited that there's going to be more back and forth with the Q&A, because I think seeing how this worked is much better than just like every 3 months someone asks and then we get an answer. Of course, accessibility. I would also like to bring up the need, which I saw in the WebEx, closed captioning was available, but also interpretation for ASL and in Spanish, and to encourage those remotely participating to turn on their cameras, because as a member of the public, it is really crummy to just look at a panel of names and not get to see the folks that we're interacting with. And I think someone in the public comments brought up, there's all these comments on the docket, but we never hear summary or discussion of them here. And so Tina, I think, did mention all of the comments calling for the shutting off of the gas, but so I think some kind of like summary and report back of what people are putting on that docket and a response to it. And then outreach about these meetings and solicitation of the comments. I think we always wind up like word of mouth finding out when these meetings are happening. So I think it could be much better to solicit a public input. And I believe that was all my slides. The very last slide is really just all my questions put in one spot to make it easier for responses.
Thank you very much, Courtney. That was a great presentation, and I agree it was a good exchange.
Yeah, and thanks for, I assume we went way over time, and I appreciate it.
We did, and that's mostly our fault because of these technical difficulties, and I want to again apologize to the entire audience and the DOB members. I take full responsibility for everything that goes on with these meetings, and I appreciate Supervisor Becker's good recommendation that if we're having it here, that the people that are most familiar with the technology here run the show. I have to apologize to the remaining 4 or 5 speakers that were in the queue. We wanted to get to you. It's almost 10 o'clock. The technical challenges are continuing. I think people would like to wrap the meeting at this point. I want to keep track of the names that are in the queue and commit that you will be the very first to be offered an opportunity to speak at the public forum in July.
But with that,
Tom, can
yes, Richard?
Just one thing on SMRs. There is a provision in the joint proposal that says that Holtec can't site SMRs at the site unless they get approval of the state and local municipalities. They can't even apply for siting.
Right. So, but I think the folks I've heard from don't want one there. So I'd be curious to hear, you know, like have a presentation on what it is so this community is aware.
I mean, you know, it was written into the JP to give people some assurance that Holtec can't just slide an application into the NRC and get it approved.
Yeah, and look, I think that goes to the future use of the site. We started to talk about that earlier with Mana's comments and others. And I think that's going to be an ongoing topic of discussion. And the topics that you raised are topics we are also aware of and are thinking about for future meetings. So I appreciate that. With that, I really appreciate everyone's patience tonight. This is a difficult meeting with the technology challenges. We're going to do better. And I'll wish you all a good night. Thank you.